Hello, fellow sapiens. Sit back, relax, and prepare to drift through the quiet edges of science, where reality, memory, and evolution begin to blur. This is Sleepless Homo, a space for soft science and slow storytelling, for the curious minds who can't quite sleep, who think better in the dark. Here we explore deep time, humble research, and the strange beauty of how we became what we are. One quiet discovery at a time. Now imagine this, a world without colour, without shape, without even the idea of direction. A silent ocean lit only by the scattered shimmer of sunlight filtering through ancient water, long before eyes existed to notice it. For hundreds of millions of years, life had lived blind, drifting, sensing only the simplest gradients of warmth or the faint trace of chemicals that meant food or danger. Then, sometime around 600 million years ago, something extraordinary began to happen. A few microscopic cells evolved the ability to react not just to heat or touch, but to light itself. That moment, tiny, unseen, and chemical, was the first flicker of what we now call vision. It was not a window opening onto the world. It was the birth of illusion. For in that first reaction between photon and molecule, there was no colour, no form, no beauty, only energy striking matter. The earliest light-sensitive cells were not eyes, but pigments, simple proteins called opsins embedded in cell membranes, able to absorb light and trigger a small electrical change. To the creature, it was nothing more than a signal, moved toward or away. Yet evolution is patient. Over vast spans of time, these pigments grew more organised, clustered, folded inward, forming shallow cups that could tell not just the presence of light, but its direction. Each tiny adaptation was a guess, an evolutionary experiment. And slowly, out of the endless blur of the Cambrian seas, shapes began to matter. The Cambrian explosion, some 540 million years ago, was not just an explosion of species, it was an explosion of perception. Fossils from this period show an unprecedented diversity of eyes, trilobites with compound mosaics, tiny worms with pigment cups, early predators with lenses that could focus. The world, once invisible, was suddenly filled with watchers, and the watched. The emergence of vision changed evolution itself. Once creatures could see, everything became a potential signal: colour, motion, symmetry, deception. A visual arms race began, and reality, as experienced by life, fractured into millions of subjective worlds. To imagine that moment is to realise that light, before perception, had no meaning. Photons had been streaming from the sun for billions of years, bouncing, refracting, scattering through atmosphere and ocean. But without an eye, there was no such thing as brightness or darkness. Those are inventions of nervous systems, not properties of physics. When life learned to trap light inside pigment and translate it into action, it was not discovering the world, it was constructing one. The first eyes did not reveal objective truth. They filtered chaos into something survivable. Consider the trilobite, one of the earliest animals with complex eyes. Its lenses were made not of soft tissue but of calcite, a mineral crystal. Each tiny lens was a perfectly engineered optical device, hard as stone yet capable of refraction. Some species had thousands of them across their exoskeleton, each sending information to a simple neural cluster. To us, it might seem primitive, but for its time it was revolutionary. A trilobite could now distinguish predator from prey, light from shadow, surface from depth. It could navigate, it could aim. And all of that meant one thing: it could survive longer and reproduce. The brain, such as it was, began to reward pattern over randomness, and so began a deep evolutionary truth. What organisms perceive is not the world as it is, but the world as it is useful to them. A shrimp's eyes, tuned to polarized light, show a world of hidden reflections we will never see. A worm's pigment cells register only dark and bright. A jellyfish senses the direction of sunlight, though it has no brain to think about it. Each species lives inside its own hallucination, shaped by natural selection. What we call seeing is not seeing. It is modelling. To perceive light is to compress the infinite spectrum of reality into manageable, meaningful guesses. If that sounds abstract, it's only because we are still trapped inside our own model. The ocean of the early Cambrian didn't suddenly become visible when vision evolved. It became interpretable. The light striking those first eyes didn't carry little labels that said predator or food. It was noise. The organisms that survived were the ones that filtered that noise in ways that helped them act. Turn left, dig down, hide. Over millions of generations, these useful hallucinations became hardwired instincts. A predator's neural system would fire at motion, not detail. Prey would respond to contrast, not clarity. The brain evolved not to see truth, but to ignore what didn't matter. In that sense, every eye in Earth's history has been a selective liar. From the compound facets of insects to the pinhole lenses of mollusks, vision always meant distortion in service of survival. The clearer the picture, the more energy it cost. The faster the reaction, the more reality had to be simplified. Even in modern animals, perception is astonishingly incomplete. Humans can detect only a narrow slice of the electromagnetic spectrum, less than 1/10 trillionth of the total. We call that slice visible light. To a mantis shrimp, we are half blind. To a bat, utterly deaf to the world's texture. To an electric eel, oblivious to entire dimensions of charge and flow. Yet each species feels its own world as complete, as real. That is the genius of evolution's illusion. It convinces every creature that its limited version of reality is enough. When paleontologists study Cambrian fossils like Anomalocaris, they find eye structures more complex than anything before them. Large compound arrays with thousands of lenses, each connected to a neural bundle. These were the first true predators of light, capable of detecting subtle movements in the water column. To the prey, these glimmers of motion were doom. For the first time in history, seeing became hunting. Evolution rewarded those who could interpret photons as futures. Where will that shadow be in a moment? Which direction must I flee? Every glance became a prediction, every movement a calculation of probabilities. That is where the line between seeing and thinking began to blur. Even without what we would call consciousness, these early visual systems were beginning to anticipate. They didn't just react to stimuli, they forecasted them. The foundations of what neuroscientists today call predictive processing, our brain's constant simulation of the next moment, were being laid in those ancient seas. The mind was not yet born, but its blueprint was being drafted by natural selection. In the geological record, we see that after vision evolved, the complexity of life skyrocketed. Predation increased, camouflage evolved, shells hardened, and body plans diversified. The simple presence of sight transformed the evolutionary landscape. Some scientists have even suggested that the Cambrian explosion itself might have been triggered by the invention of eyes, that once organisms could detect one another visually, it unleashed an ecological cascade of adaptation and counter-adaptation. Vision didn't just open a window to the world, it ignited an arms race of perception. It is humbling to realize that every image we see today, every sunset, every face, every screen, is the distant descendant of that same biological trick. Light enters our eyes, strikes photoreceptors, and is converted into a chain of electrical guesses. Those guesses climb through layers of neurons, comparing memory, probability, and expectation, until the brain produces what we call sight. Yet in truth, nothing of the external world enters us. The photons that touch your retina cease to exist the instant they are absorbed. What remains is an internal simulation, a map, updated each millisecond and mistaken for reality. That mistake, however, is what allowed life to flourish, because to survive it's better to act on a useful illusion than to hesitate in perfect accuracy. A tiny error in colour or motion might mean mistaking a leaf for an insect, or an insect for a leaf. But the cost of seeing too much, of waiting for certainty, is death. So natural selection favoured hallucination, fast, biased, efficient. The world we experience is not a recording. It is a sketch drawn in real time by a brain that has been editing for 600 million years. When you close your eyes tonight, the darkness behind your eyelids is ancient. Every flicker of imagined light, every shifting pattern, is built on the same chemistry that first responded to the Cambrian sun. The modern retina still carries the layered architecture of those primordial eyes. Rods and cones like stacked evolutionary fossils, each adapted from earlier pigments. The pathways that carry your vision to your brain stem still echo the first neural loops that made light mean movement. We are not separate from that lineage. We are its continuation. To think of sight this way is to feel both awe and humility. Every colour you see is a story told by your nervous system, every boundary a decision made by ancestral chemistry. The ocean that once shimmered without witnesses is now filled with minds, each convinced that its vision is real. Perhaps that is the ultimate triumph of evolution, that it built from blind molecules and random photons, a world that can now look back and wonder how it came to see. We will never know exactly what the first eyes saw, if seeing even describes it. But we can say this much. When light first entered biology, reality itself changed. Not in the external world, rocks and tides cared little, but in the inner landscapes of those who survived because they learned to imagine. To perceive is to hallucinate successfully. And the history of vision is the history of that illusion growing ever more sophisticated, ever more convincing, until one day a species looked into the water and believed it saw itself. That story begins here, in the first flicker. If you find calm in this kind of late-night knowledge, consider subscribing. It helps other sleepless thinkers find their way here too. Tell me where you're listening from, in bed, on headphones, while working, or somewhere between awake and dreaming. And if you drift off along the way, don't worry. The timestamps will guide you back. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Imagine this. The first eyes have already opened, but the minds behind them are still blind. In the oceans of 500 million years ago, light is everywhere, rippling, bending, shattering into reflections off scales and shells. But nothing yet understands it. Vision exists, but meaning does not. The trilobites and early fish of this world are surrounded by brightness they cannot quite interpret. Their simple brains fire at motion, at shadow, at change, but they do not yet know what those signals mean. The story of sight now shifts from chemistry to computation. It is not about collecting light anymore, but about guessing what that light might reveal. In the fossil-rich layers of what we now call the Burgess Shale, creatures from this time show us the earliest architecture of prediction. A trilobite's nervous system, though primitive, was already divided into regions for processing direction and contrast. In its own way, it was trying to solve a problem that every brain since has faced: how to act when the world moves faster than you can think. Each flicker of light meant something: food, danger, shadow, depth. But which? The trilobite's compound eyes, made of hundreds of mineral lenses, could detect subtle changes across its field of view. The brain behind them, a narrow ladder of neurons, learned to compare those changes from one moment to the next, and in that comparison, meaning began to form. It is strange to think that what we now call attention may have started as nothing more than a bias toward novelty. A sudden shift in brightness, a moving silhouette, These triggered early neural responses because they broke the pattern. The ancient ocean was full of such broken patterns: rippling sunlight, drifting silt, flashing scales. Any creature that could distinguish a real approach from random noise gained a powerful advantage. Over time, the neural circuitry for detecting change grew more complex, adding tiny layers of delay and anticipation. Brains learned to predict what light would do next. By around 500 million years ago, some early jawless fish, creatures like 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒 and 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐿, were beginning to coordinate light with motion. Their sensory organs were simple, yet their neural cords showed evidence of segmentation, allowing parallel processing of visual information. They could track the movement of plankton and shift direction accordingly. This was not thought or choice as we understand it. It was prediction made flesh. A fish that could expect the next glimmer of prey, even by a fraction of a second, could strike before its rival. Evolution was teaching life to anticipate. Modern neuroscience tells us that even simple nervous systems engage in a kind of statistical learning. When a pattern repeats, the neurons involved begin to fire in expectation of it. When that pattern breaks, the signal changes. This is the root of what, in humans, becomes surprise, curiosity, and learning. But in those Cambrian and Ordovician oceans, it was pure survival. Each brain was a sculpted memory of successful guesses. A world of endless light had become a world of expectations, flicker by flicker, synapse by synapse. We often imagine early life as instinctive and reactive, but the fossil record and modern analogues suggest something subtler. Take the modern horseshoe crab, a living descendant of that ancient sensory lineage. Its compound eyes are direct heirs of trilobite optics, and its neural system still filters light in rhythmic waves. It detects movement across its visual field in predictable sequences, essentially performing primitive motion analysis. In doing so, it tells us something profound about its ancestors, that even without thought, a creature can model time. Every flick of its tail and twitch of its leg is calibrated to expectations about what light will do next. The ocean is not chaos to it. It is a patterned prediction. This transformation of sensation into meaning is perhaps the most underappreciated event in the history of life. The invention of the eye may have made the world visible, but the invention of the brain made it interpretable. And yet, there was a cost. Once organisms began predicting the world, they also began to depend on their models more than on the raw data itself. A trilobite's eyes could register thousands of points of light per second, but its brain had to simplify that flood into manageable information. It ignored most of what it saw, focusing only on change, contrast, or direction. In other words, the first filters were born. Through those filters, the ocean became a kind of private theatre for every species. For a trilobite, reality was a flickering horizon of brightness and shadow. For a primitive fish, it was a tunnel of movement framed by light gradients. For a worm, perhaps, a vertical shimmer of up and down. Each lived in its own partial truth, its own small window of interpretation. From this multiplicity of partial realities emerged the dynamic ecological web that drove evolution forward. Vision, now meaningful, allowed both cooperation and conflict to become more complex. Predator and prey entered a dance of signal and anticipation that still defines life today. Among the most remarkable fossils from this era are the early armoured fish known as ostracoderms. They possess sensory canals along their heads, precursors to the lateral line systems found in modern fish. These canals could detect subtle shifts in water pressure and flow, integrating that information with visual input. When light and motion matched, the brain confirmed the prediction. When they did not, it triggered an alert response. The first nervous systems capable of combining sensory streams had arrived. The ocean was no longer a single field of vision. It was a multi-layered world of correlations. And yet this ability to integrate and predict did not mean awareness as we know it. the early fish did not see in the sense of recognizing beauty or danger. Their brains were small, perhaps the size of a grain of sand, and their neural activity purely mechanical. But that mechanical activity, those electrochemical guesses, were the foundation of everything that would follow. To turn light into meaning is to turn the universe into information. For the first time, life was not just reacting to the present, it was modelling the near future. Modern research on visual processing in vertebrates suggests that the basic neural architecture for prediction is extremely ancient. The optic tectum, a midbrain region found in fish, amphibians and reptiles, already existed in these early vertebrates. It acts as a spatial map of the surrounding environment, constantly updated by incoming sensory data. Each movement of a predator or prey corresponds to a shifting pattern of activity on this map. When the pattern repeats, the system anticipates the next shift before it happens. This mechanism allows fish to hunt and evade with astonishing precision, despite having brains a fraction the size of a human fingertip. The architecture of prediction had been built long before consciousness entered the story. In this age, light ceased to be a mere environmental factor. It became a signal. The sun and the shadows it cast drove not only the rhythm of days, but the rhythm of neural learning. Even plankton responded to this cycle, rising toward the surface by day and sinking by night in what biologists call the diel vertical migration. These patterns, repeated for millions of years, etched temporal awareness into biology itself. Every dawn became a lesson, every dusk a rehearsal. The brain, as it evolved, was shaped not by random experience but by the consistent, predictable behaviour of light. It is tempting to think of these creatures as primitive, but in truth they lived in a world more precise than ours. Their survival depended on instantaneous detection of patterns invisible to us, the angle of a wave, the flicker of a scale, the faint disruption of a shadow. In that sensitivity lay the earliest form of what we might call inference. The neural code they developed, fast, biased, approximate, would later become the foundation of all cognition. What began as photoreceptors predicting motion would, in time, become thoughts predicting meaning. Even today, our own visual systems work much the same way. Most of what we see is prediction refined by error correction. The retina sends only a fraction of its data to the brain. The rest is filled in from memory and expectation. We are descendants of those ancient fish, still filtering the flood of light through the narrow channel of probability. When you turn your head and see a moving object, your brain is already predicting where it will be before the photons arrive. That reflex is older than bones. The Ordovician seas that followed the Cambrian explosion were crowded and perilous. New predators like Cephalaspis cruised the shallows, guided by light-sensitive ridges and a growing central nervous system. These were among the first creatures to possess a true brain case, a skull protecting a concentrated mass of neural tissue. With protection came specialization. Neurons that once fired randomly now formed circuits devoted to processing sensory sequences. The brain began to partition itself into functional zones, each tuned to a particular kind of prediction. One for sight, one for balance, one for pressure. Complexity was no longer a luxury, it was a weapon. We can almost trace the evolutionary handwriting from these fossils. Each small increase in neural density corresponds to a jump in behavioural sophistication. A fish that could coordinate its fin movements with visual cues gained an edge in escape and pursuit. A trilobite that could distinguish between shifting shadows and genuine threat saved precious energy. These were the quiet revolutions that shaped the living world. None of them required awareness. They required accuracy of anticipation. There is a certain poetry in that idea, that life's first intelligence was not thought, but expectation. The neural ancestors of our own brains were prediction engines long before they were storytellers. Their reality was built not from what they saw, but from what they guessed. In a way, the early ocean was the first stage for imagination, though no creature knew it. Every glimmer of light was a question, every movement a possibility. Evolution's answer was the same every time: learn to expect or die. If we could stand at the shore of that ancient sea and look down through the water, we would see a living algorithm at work, millions of tiny systems constantly revising their model of the world, discarding errors, reinforcing patterns. The brilliance of sunlight on rippling waves would seem chaotic to us, but to them it was a structured code. Each shimmer carried information about direction, depth, and proximity. What to us looks like randomness was, for them, the language of life. And yet, for all its sophistication, this system was fragile. It relied entirely on continuity, on the assumption that the future would resemble the past. When volcanic ash dimmed the sky or currents turned murky, these ancient prediction engines faltered. Whole ecosystems collapsed because light itself changed. For those that survived, resilience meant adaptability, not certainty. The organisms that could learn new patterns, form new expectations, and rewire their neural filters inherited the seas. Flexibility became evolution's most valuable currency. From this fragile beginning, the architecture of all future brains took shape. Networks became hierarchies, reflexes became feedback loops, and perception evolved into something resembling computation. The brain had learned to anticipate light, but it was also learning a deeper rule, that survival means predicting the unpredictable. And so, the first great lesson of the living mind was written not in language or logic, but in photons. To live in a world of light was to live in a world of probabilities. Those who could interpret that light thrived. Those who couldn't vanished. Every thought, every decision, every glance that we take for granted today carries the echo of that era, the time when life first learned to make sense of brightness before it drowned in it. The first eyes that saw land did not see a landscape at all. They saw chaos, blinding, unfiltered, unbent light. For hundreds of millions of years, vision had evolved underwater, in a world where light was softened, diffused, and predictable. Water filtered brightness into gradients. It turned sunlight into sculpture. But when the first vertebrates crawled out of the sea roughly 350 million years ago, the world above was not forgiving. The air was harsh and sharp. Light no longer curved gently through the water. It struck everything directly. Edges appeared. Shadows lengthened. Colours that had never existed underwater. Brilliant greens, violent yellows, deep reds, suddenly flared into being. Reality, as the eyes of life knew it, had to be reinvented from scratch. On the edges of Devonian swamps and shallow estuaries, fish with strange, stout fins began experimenting with gravity. They were not yet amphibians, not yet fully terrestrial, but they were learning to navigate a new medium, air. These pioneers, such as Tiktaalik and Acanthostega, faced more than mechanical challenges of weight and breathing. They were entering an optical revolution. Water and air bend light differently. The refractive index that made fish eyes perfect underwater rendered them blurry on land. What had once been clear became distorted. For evolution, that meant re-engineering the geometry of perception itself. The shape of the eye began to change. The spherical lenses of aquatic ancestors, ideal for the dense medium of water, now needed to flatten to focus light accurately through air. Muscles evolved to alter lens curvature and pupil shape, allowing sharper images. The eyelid, which had never been necessary underwater, emerged as protection against dryness and debris. Even tear glands evolved to keep the cornea moist, a small, vital adjustment in the grand experiment of sight. Each adaptation represented a species attempting to redraw the boundary between chaos and comprehension. But the real revolution wasn't in the eye, it was in the brain behind it. In water, distance had been guessed from motion and shading. On land, those cues collapsed. The environment became too open, too bright, too full of empty space. For the first time, creatures needed a way to calculate how far away something truly was. And so, nature began to experiment with binocular vision. Two eyes, angled slightly toward each other, created overlapping fields of view. The difference between what each eye saw, the disparity, became the raw material for a new mental skill. Depth perception. Reality became three-dimensional, not because the world changed, but because brains learned to model it that way. Fossil skulls from early amphibians show the gradual widening of the orbits, the sockets where eyes sat, allowing them to point more forward than sideways. In predators like Areops, this gave an enormous advantage, the ability to judge distance precisely before striking. For prey animals, the opposite happened. Their eyes migrated to the sides of their heads to maximize field of view. Evolution was now sculpting behavior through geometry. Every skull was a map of priorities, focus or vigilance, attack or awareness. The neural networks required to interpret binocular disparity were complex, involving synchronization between hemispheres and coordination with the developing vestibular system for balance. It was no longer enough to react to visual stimuli. The brain had to build an internal model of space and update it with each movement. This was the birth of spatial awareness as we know it, the invisible map within the head that mirrors the outer world. Without it, a leap between stones or a lunge at prey would end in failure. To move on land was to trust a hallucination of space accurate enough to keep you alive. Meanwhile, the world itself was transforming. The Carboniferous period brought thick forests and towering ferns that cast deep, mottled shadows. For creatures accustomed to the consistent glow of underwater light, this dappled environment demanded new ways to process contrast and texture. The eyes of land vertebrates evolved finer arrays of photoreceptors, improving resolution and contrast sensitivity. The brain's visual cortex, or its ancient equivalent, began specializing in edge detection, recognizing where one surface ended and another began. Reality, in the biological sense, was becoming a mosaic of boundaries. To imagine how disorienting this transition was, consider the sensory silence of early amphibians stepping from a swamp into the dry world. In water, vibration carried information. On land, the same signals vanished into stillness. Sound, which travels far in air but poorly in water, became a new sense entirely. The tympanic membranes of some species began to form, converting pressure waves into vibration, an evolutionary improvisation to fill the gap. But the brain had to integrate these new sources with the old. Sight and sound, balance and muscle feedback, all had to align into a single, continuous representation of space. In that integration lay the first true terrestrial mind. One of the earliest clues to how these brains worked comes from fossils of Ichthyostega, a transitional species with limbs strong enough to support its weight, and a skull showing expanded regions for processing sensory input. The optic nerves were thicker, the olfactory bulbs larger, the brainstem more complex. This was no longer a fish reacting to flickers. It was an animal constructing a world in its head. Its eyes could track insects or movement across the forest floor, and its limbs could follow those predictions through uneven terrain. In that coordination, thought began to acquire dimension. By the late Carboniferous, the planet was alive with new light. The atmosphere was rich in oxygen, and the sun, filtered through thick vegetation, painted the world in contrasts. Bright shafts piercing green canopies, quick shadows rippling across leaf litter. Every beam of light carried information. The outline of a predator, the shimmer of a mate, the angle of the sun. To survive, creatures learned to decode these cues into geometry and timing. The brain became a navigator, a machine for predicting trajectories and planning paths. Evolution had, in a sense, invented mental cartography. Fossil evidence suggests that as vision became sharper, behaviours followed. Early reptiles developed hunting strategies based on anticipation rather than reflex. Tracks preserved in Permian mudstones show curving pursuit paths rather than random motion, implying the capacity to predict where prey would run. To anticipate motion is to imagine space, and to imagine space is to construct an invisible world inside your head. A model you can test before acting. The land that needed a map forced the mind to become one. Even the colour of vision changed. On land, sunlight contained a wider spectrum than underwater light. Cone cells diversified, allowing animals to distinguish a range of wavelengths, from reds reflecting off soil to greens echoing through foliage. For the first time, colour became a source of meaning, not just sensation. A bright hue might signal ripeness or danger. Contrast could indicate movement or mimicry. The natural world began to write its own language of light, and evolution taught the eye to read it. It is easy to overlook how monumental this shift was. To leave the sea was to abandon an environment where physics itself helped perception. Water slows movement and dampens light, creating a kind of evolutionary cushion. Air, by contrast, is brutally immediate. Every mistake happens faster, shadows stretch longer. There is no refraction to soften distance or sound. The organisms that succeeded were those that could cope with that immediacy, those that could build predictive models of their surroundings fast enough to act before reality confirmed their guesses. Over time, those internal maps became more sophisticated. The optic tectum, which in fish handled spatial orientation, expanded in early reptiles into a more layered structure capable of integrating multiple sensory cues. Neural pathways linking sight to movement became faster and more efficient. In some lineages, like the ancestors of lizards and early archosaurs, the eyes moved independently but could converge for depth, allowing a dynamic form of three-dimensional awareness. The landscape was no longer a flat backdrop, but a network of navigable distances. This new kind of vision reshaped ecosystems. Predators who mastered depth perception could strike with precision. Prey who mastered spatial mapping could evade in 3 dimensions. A constant feedback loop emerged between perception and motion. Each side of that evolutionary arms race refined the same skill, building a better model of the world. The clearer that model became, the more complex behaviour could grow. In this sense, the birth of terrestrial sight was also the birth of strategy. When paleontologists examine fossilised trackways from this era, they see patterns that suggest deliberate navigation around obstacles and cooperative movement through terrain. To us, they look like random footprints, but to those creatures, they were the record of thought unfolding in real time, a visual prediction turned into action. A lizard-like reptile crossing a floodplain had to remember the layout of the land, anticipate the next safe spot, and keep that invisible map updated as it moved. Memory was beginning to merge with perception, and with that the brain's role shifted once again. It was no longer simply interpreting light. It was combining vision with memory, balance and motion to form a unified experience of reality. The external world had become an internal landscape. In many ways, this was the first glimpse of what we might call perspective, not just seeing, but being somewhere within a mental model of space. If we strip away our modern awareness and imagine the world as those early creatures saw it, it must have been dazzling. Every colour oversaturated, every edge too sharp. Shadows did not blur softly like they do underwater, they cut like blades. Distance for the first time existed as a felt thing, a gap to cross, a risk to misjudge. The invention of depth perception made space itself a character in life's unfolding story. We often think of intelligence as language or reason, but perhaps it began with the simple act of drawing a map, first in light, then in motion, and finally in memory. Those first terrestrial vertebrates carried in their small brains the beginnings of that mental geography, the same invisible grid that today allows us to walk through a room without colliding with furniture or to imagine what lies beyond the horizon. Their world was raw, blinding and unforgiving, but in learning to see it clearly, they gave future life the capacity for imagination itself. The next time you close one eye and lose your sense of depth, remember that the three-dimensional world you take for granted is not an objective truth. It is an invention, an evolved illusion carved by the struggles of amphibians and reptiles who learned to predict the solid ground beneath their fins. Without them, reality might still be flat. The world is dark again. Forests hum with the sound of insects and the low rumble of giant feet. In the undergrowth, a small creature waits, hidden beneath ferns and leaf litter, nose twitching in the night. Above, the dinosaurs rule the open plains and the daylight. But in these shadows, under roots, inside burrows, behind fallen logs, another kind of mind is forming. It is not the mind of sight or sound. It is a mind built on scent. Around 200 million years ago, as the first true mammals evolved in the long shadow of the Mesozoic giants, the sense of smell became their lifeline to the world and their way of remembering it. The early mammals of the Jurassic were small, fragile, and mostly nocturnal. They lived in a landscape where visibility meant death. To survive, they learned to feel their surroundings through the invisible molecules that filled the air. Every movement, every breath, every passing creature left behind a chemical trail, a story written in scent. These tiny survivors, like Morganucodon, Hadrocodium, and Eomia, carried in their skulls a new kind of brain, one dominated by the olfactory bulbs. These structures, sitting just above the snout, were proportionally enormous compared to those of their reptilian ancestors. The early mammal's brain was, in a literal sense, built around smell. To understand why, it helps to imagine what their nights were like. The Mesozoic darkness was not silent, but it was deceptive. Leaves rustled, twigs cracked, air currents shifted unpredictably. Eyes were of little use in such deep shadow. Smell, however, worked in 3 dimensions. The nose could build a world from absence, from molecules lingering long after the source had gone. A predator's passing trail might linger for minutes or hours. A flowering plant could mark the change of season. A faint shift in scent could mean rain. For early mammals, reality was not something seen. It was something inhaled, layer by layer, into memory. The olfactory system in mammals connects directly to parts of the brain responsible for emotion and memory, the limbic system, including the hippocampus and amygdala. This is not coincidence. It is evolution's architecture. Long before vision was tied to reason, smell was tied to feeling. To smell something was to remember it, and to remember it was to feel it. Modern neuroscience shows that the pathways from the nose reach the hippocampus without passing through the thalamus, the brain's usual relay centre for sensory information. That shortcut made scent a direct emotional trigger, an adaptation that may have begun with these early night dwellers. In fossils, we can't smell the air they breathed, but we can see the brain cases they left behind. CT scans of Morganucodon skulls reveal expanded olfactory bulbs and larger cerebral hemispheres compared to reptiles of similar size. These changes suggest not just a keener sense of smell, but the capacity to integrate and store olfactory information over time. The mammalian brain was beginning to build a map of scent and memory, a way of recognizing patterns and predicting outcomes based on odor alone. The smell of a particular plant might signal safety. The scent of decay might mean danger. Through smell, these creatures began to anchor emotion to place. In this dark, humid world, scent became not just a sense, but a language. Molecules carried messages across time and space. When a predator marked territory, it was writing an invisible warning that others could read long after it had gone. When a mother located her young in the nest, she did so through unique chemical signatures imprinted at birth. When males and females found each other, scent guided courtship more reliably than sight. The nocturnal brain evolved to translate these signals into instinctive knowledge. A faint trace in the air could recall an entire sequence of past events. Smell became memory, and memory became survival. The evolution of warm-bloodedness played a crucial role in this sensory transformation. By maintaining constant internal temperatures, mammals could remain active at night, when reptiles cooled into sluggish stillness. But being active in the dark required a sensory system that did not depend on light. Olfaction fit perfectly. It worked in total darkness, at any temperature, through obstacles and across distances. The night world was not silent or empty. It was saturated with chemical information. Early mammals simply learned how to read it better than anyone else. Interestingly, the development of fur, another hallmark of mammals, may have deepened this olfactory connection. Fur trapped scent molecules, allowing individuals to carry their own chemical identity. It became a surface for communication, a medium of social memory. Grooming, rubbing, and marking behaviours, seen today in almost every mammal, have roots in these early nocturnal interactions. To exchange scent was to exchange information, to establish familiarity, even trust. Smell, emotion, and social life began to weave together. The fossil record of the Jurassic and early Cretaceous shows that mammals diversified quietly under the dinosaurs' feet, exploring new ecological niches. Some, like Castrocauda, adapted to aquatic life. Others, like Volaticotherium, glided through the air. Yet all of them shared the same enlarged olfactory regions. Their brains were not built for sight or sound, but for mapping invisible gradients of odour. This evolutionary emphasis created the foundation for complex associative memory. The hippocampus, the structure that allows animals to link events in sequence, likely evolved alongside this growing olfactory capacity. In other words, mammals may have learned to remember time because they learned to remember smell. Imagine a small shrew-like creature darting through underbrush in the late Jurassic night. Each breath carries a world of data, the musk of its kin, the faint decay of leaves, the wet mineral scent of distant rain. As it moves, it leaves its own trace behind, a chemical breadcrumb trail others can follow. Its survival depends on knowing not just what these smells mean, but when they last occurred. The scent of a predator an hour old may mean safety. One a minute old means run. The mammalian brain became a time machine through scent, reconstructing invisible histories. Modern analogues help us glimpse how this worked. Small nocturnal mammals today, shrews, rodents, tenrecs, possess massive olfactory bulbs relative to brain size. They navigate complex environments entirely through smell, building mental maps of tunnels, burrows, and food sources. Their memories of scent sequences allow them to retrace paths days later. This ability likely evolved from their ancient Mesozoic ancestors, who learned to think in odour rather than image. To us, that world would seem abstract and intangible, but to them it was vivid and immediate, filled with emotional texture. As mammals grew more social, olfaction also became the medium of recognition and attachment. Mothers identified offspring by scent. Infants found the nipple through olfactory cues. Studies of early mammal fossils show a consistent pattern. Species that exhibited evidence of parental care also had proportionally larger olfactory bulbs. Smell was the biological glue that held kinship together. Through it, emotional bonds became anchored to memory. The warmth of a nest, the musk of safety, the scent of danger, all stored in neural pathways that would eventually evolve into complex emotional associations. This connection between scent and emotion shaped the mammalian experience of fear as well. Unlike reptiles, whose responses were largely reflexive, Mammals began to pair stimuli with memory. The smell of a predator could trigger panic even before danger was visible. The amygdala, deep in the brain, processed these cues and stored them as learned fear. Over generations, this system refined itself into anticipatory behaviour. The brain did not just react, it remembered. The smell of memory in this sense was the birth of imagination, the ability to feel something that was not immediately present. We might think of this as the first form of dreaming in the evolutionary story. Not visual dreaming, but emotional recall. To relive a scent long after it faded was to relive a piece of time. Through this, the mammalian brain began linking emotion, place, and sequence into coherent experience. The hippocampus became the archive of the night, sorting signals by relevance. The brain was learning to say, this scent mattered, that one did not. All of this occurred while dinosaurs dominated the day. The great reptiles basked in the sun, while beneath their notice, small furred beings built a new sensory universe, quietly, invisibly in the dark. Evolution has a habit of reshaping constraints into advantages. Forced into night by ecological pressure, mammals turned darkness into an opportunity. Their descendants would inherit not only sharper senses but a new kind of inner life. The Mesozoic nights must have been beautiful in their own strange way. Imagine walking through a Jurassic forest at dusk, the air thick with the smell of resin, wet soil and fern pollen, the stars just beginning to appear. Somewhere nearby, a small mammal stirs, its whiskers trembling as it inhales the invisible signatures of the world. Every scent tells a story, of rain, of hunger, of kin. To that creature, smell is not just information, it is feeling, memory, and meaning intertwined. And perhaps this is the true turning point of mammalian evolution. The moment when perception became nostalgia, when the external world left an echo inside the brain. The ability to remember smells long after they were gone meant that the world could now exist in absence. It could be imagined. That single neurological leap laid the groundwork for what would one day become memory as we understand it. Memory tied not to logic or sight, but to the ineffable weight of emotion. What began as a chemical detection system became the foundation of empathy, attachment, and recollection. Every breath taken by those small nocturnal ancestors deepened the connection between sense and self, between the present and the past. In the dark beneath the dinosaurs, the mammalian brain began to dream with its nose. Imagine this. The world is still ruled by dinosaurs, but their time is ending. The great reptiles sleep in humid forests, their breath slow beneath a sky that never quite darkens. Somewhere in the canopy above them, a small mammal curls into its nest of leaves, its body warm, its eyelids flickering. Beneath the thin bone of its skull, its brain is alive with motion. Neurons fire in rhythmic bursts, muscles twitch faintly, and the tiny creature's eyes dart beneath closed lids. It is dreaming, or something close to it. Long before language, before reflection, before waking thought, the first mammals and birds began to experience this strange nightly rehearsal. It was not imagination yet, but something older, quieter, born from the need to survive. When scientists study the fossilized skulls of early Cretaceous and Paleocene mammals, they see evidence of an ever-expanding brain, especially in regions tied to sensory integration and emotion. The neocortex was growing, but deeper inside, older structures remained dominant. The limbic system, the hippocampus, the brainstem. These were the engines of memory and instinct. Within them, cycles of rest and activity were already hardwired into biology. Even in reptiles, simple forms of sleep exist, but it was the mammals and their close relatives, the birds, who took it further. They evolved a state of neural activity that mimicked wakefulness while the body remained still. a paradox of paralysis and motion we now call REM sleep. Modern neuroscience suggests that REM, rapid eye movement, is not just rest but simulation. During these periods, the brain replays sensory experiences, rearranges memories, and tests hypothetical outcomes. To dream, in the evolutionary sense, is to practice without risk. When life became warm-blooded, the cost of constant alertness rose dramatically. Energy had to be conserved, yet learning still needed to occur. So evolution found a compromise, a nightly theatre where the brain could refine its models of the world without ever leaving the nest. Early mammals lived under pressure no creature had faced before. They were small, hunted, and forced into the safety of darkness. Every noise could mean death. Every decision, when to flee, when to freeze, when to wait, was a calculation of survival. Their brains, shaped by experience, began replaying those calculations even in sleep. Neurons that fired during waking navigation or escape sequences reactivated spontaneously at night. In modern animals, this is measurable. Place cells in the hippocampus, responsible for mapping space, echo their activity during dreams, as if rehearsing past journeys. If that pattern holds deep evolutionary roots, then the same mechanism may have existed in our distant ancestors. The mammalian brain was learning by simulation before it learned by thought. We often imagined sleep as a retreat from the world, but for early mammals it may have been the safest time to process it. Hidden in burrows, curled inside hollow logs, their small bodies conserved heat while their minds rehearsed danger. The pattern of REM sleep, brief, cyclical, and energetically costly, suggests it offered something essential. It may have allowed the brain to stabilize memory, strengthen neural connections, and simulate future events using fragments of past experience. In this sense, dreaming was a quiet evolutionary revolution. Life was beginning to model itself internally, detached from immediate input. Birds, who share a common ancestor with reptiles, arrived at similar solution. By the late Cretaceous, their brains had evolved a highly developed forebrain called the pallium, analogous to the mammalian cortex. Like mammals, they displayed REM-like sleep cycles, with rapid eye movements and muscle atonia. Modern studies of zebra finches show that during sleep, their brains replay song patterns learned while awake. The neurons involved in producing complex vocal sequences fire again in the same rhythm, as if the bird were singing silently in its dreams. This suggests that rehearsal during rest is ancient and widespread, a mechanism for refining behaviour even when the body cannot act. If dreaming began as rehearsal, then it was less about fantasy and more about precision. Each nocturnal mammal and bird carried a miniature simulation engine inside its head, tuning itself to the unpredictable world. A shrew-like insectivore might run the same chase sequence hundreds of times in its sleep, refining reactions by tiny increments. A young bird might replay the sound of its parent's call, adjusting its neural timing until it could reproduce the pattern perfectly. These were not stories but algorithms, nature's first virtual realities. The biology behind it is astonishingly consistent across species. In both birds and mammals, REM sleep is marked by high-frequency brainwaves, similar to those of wakefulness, along with vivid physiological changes, irregular heartbeat, fluctuating temperature, and bursts of muscle twitches. The cortex, hippocampus, and amygdala all light up, suggesting an interplay of memory, emotion, and sensory integration. It is as if the brain re-enters its own data, shuffling and relinking it to improve prediction. This process may have emerged when the first warm-blooded animals began regulating internal temperature, creating natural circadian rhythms that separated active periods from rest. With reliable energy reserves, the brain could afford to invest time in offline processing. Dreaming, in this light, was evolution's way of keeping information alive. Memory is fragile. Without rehearsal, it fades. By replaying experiences during sleep, the early mammalian brain reinforced vital associations: what was safe, what was dangerous, what led to food or escape. In modern neuroscience, this is known as memory consolidation. But in the Mesozoic night, it was probably simpler. A creature dreaming of movement to prepare for movement, of scent to sharpen scent, of fear to survive fear. The boundaries between waking and sleeping blurred into a single continuous lesson. The fossil record cannot show dreams, but it can show the architecture that makes them possible. The enlargement of the neocortex, the complex folding of brain tissue, and the increased blood flow to higher regions all point toward the capacity for internal modelling. These features appeared gradually between 80 and 60 million years ago, during a period of enormous ecological upheaval. The extinction that ended the reign of dinosaurs reshaped the planet's ecosystems. Mammals and birds, already specialists in adaptation, suddenly found themselves in a new world. Their minds, built for flexibility, may have survived precisely because they could imagine outcomes before acting. Even in a living species today, we glimpse echoes of those ancient rehearsals. Cats, dogs, and rodents all show REM behaviour: twitching paws, flickering whiskers, small movements as if chasing or hiding. Birds exhibit similar micro-movements, their wings shifting slightly during dream cycles. These are not random spasms, but patterns of simulated action. The same brain circuits that control movement in waking life activate during dreams, though the body remains immobilized. Evolution ensured that the rehearsal would not spill into real motion, a safety lock in the spinal cord called REM atonia. Without it, the dream might become fatal. Why did this simulation become so deeply embedded? One hypothesis suggests that dreaming allowed for creativity in problem solving, the ability to recombine stored experiences in novel ways. A mammal that could test new strategies in its sleep without risking energy or injury would outcompete one that could not. Another view holds that dreaming is simply the byproduct of a predictive brain, a system that never stops guessing, even when sensory input is cut off. Either way, the continuity between waking prediction and sleeping simulation points to a single underlying truth: the brain does not rest, it rehearses. By the Paleocene, around 60 million years ago, mammals had diversified dramatically. The night was no longer the only refuge. Day-active species began to emerge. Yet REM sleep persisted across the entire lineage, from nocturnal shrews to early primates. This suggests that whatever function dreaming served, it was indispensable. Some scientists even propose that REM cycles became shorter and more efficient in larger-brained mammals, reflecting an optimization of information processing. The brain was learning how to learn. It is humbling to realize that the dreams of those ancient creatures may not have been so different from the sensations modern animals experience today. Not in content, but in structure. A stream of disconnected images, movements, and emotions with no conscious control. To them, these neural storms were as real as the waking world. The boundary between memory and reality did not exist. The same circuits that mapped space and fear during the day fired again in the dark. Dreaming, then, was not an escape from life. It was life continuing in another form. If we step back and look at the grand sweep of evolution, dreaming represents one of the earliest examples of internalized simulation, the ability of a brain to create a model of reality detached from the senses. That leap changed everything that followed. It allowed learning without exposure, adaptation without risk, planning without presence. In the deep time of the late Cretaceous, that was enough to tip the balance of survival. And so, somewhere in the quiet hours before dawn, a lineage of warm-blooded creatures perfected the art of rehearsal. They could run, fight, flee, and feel without moving. Their minds, no longer bound to immediate reality, began to generate their own. Long before thought, before reflection, before reason, the first dreams flickered in the darkness, tiny, neural sparks rehearsing a world that no longer needed to be seen to be known. Evolution's great experiment in imagination began there, in those unseen nights. And though we can never watch the dreams of a Jurassic mammal, we can be certain that the patterns carved into our own sleeping brains were born in theirs. Every twitch of a sleeping animal today carries that ancient signature, the mark of a mind that learned to survive by pretending to be awake. Imagine this. You're suspended in a forest that never stops moving. Light filters through a green maze of branches, leaves sway unpredictably, and every surface shifts beneath your grasp. To survive here, you must see not where things are, but where they will be a split second from now. Around 20 million years ago, this was the reality for the primates who lived and evolved among the branches of Africa and Asia. They did not just climb trees, they predicted them. Every leap, every reach, every swing demanded a brain that could forecast motion and outcome. Evolution, for the first time, was sculpting intelligence not around tools or territory, but around anticipation. In this leafy laboratory of gravity and light, primate vision transformed. Earlier mammals had already evolved remarkable eyes for nighttime survival, but daylight demanded precision. For an animal leaping several meters between branches, a minor misjudgment meant death. And so, across millions of years, eyes migrated to the front of the skull, producing overlapping fields of view and true depth perception. Binocular vision was not invented for hunting or painting. It was born in the treetops as a way to calculate distance mid-air. The primate brain, integrating sight and motion, became a forecasting engine. Fossil skulls from the early Miocene, such as those of Proconsul and Moritopithecus, reveal eye sockets set close together and facing forward, an unmistakable sign of stereoscopic sight. These creatures lived in dense forests, their skeletons built for grasping, balancing, and swinging through space. Their shoulders rotated freely, their tails acted as stabilizers, and their fingers wrapped precisely around branches. But what truly set them apart from other mammals was what happened behind the eyes. The neural regions devoted to visual processing, especially the parietal and occipital lobes, expanded dramatically. These areas allowed the brain to combine incoming sensory information with memory, creating an internal simulation of where the body would be a heartbeat later. Evolution was learning to think ahead. Each movement through the canopy was a lesson in physics long before physics had a name. A falling leaf could alter light, a gust of wind could shift a branch, a neighbouring animal could change trajectory. To thrive, primates had to model all these variables intuitively. They learned to adjust grip before landing, to extend limbs before swinging, to predict the tension of bark before contact. These are not simple reflexes. They are miniature forecasts, probabilistic guesses refined by feedback. The primate brain, in essence, became an instrument of prediction, shaped not by weapons or warfare but by trees. Colour vision too evolved under this shifting green cathedral. Early mammals, adapted for night, saw the world mostly in shades of grey. But as primates returned to daylight, the ability to detect ripe fruit, young leaves, and subtle changes in foliage colour became critical. Over time, mutations in opsin genes, the proteins that detect light wavelengths, allowed certain lineages to perceive reds and greens with greater clarity. This trichromatic vision, now standard in Old World monkeys and apes, opened an entirely new dimension of sensory detail. Colour became code. Red meant sweetness, green meant safety, yellow meant warning. The forest turned into a living data field, and the brain learned to decode it instantly. To see colour, however, is to interpret. Each hue must be compared against memory and context. The same red fruit might appear brown in shadow or orange at sunset. To distinguish true signals from illusion, the primate brain developed a more complex visual cortex, capable of analysing contrast, shape and motion simultaneously. This neural expansion didn't just sharpen sight, it deepened the brain's ability to imagine outcomes. Seeing was no longer passive, it was active inference. Modern neuroscience now recognises this mechanism as predictive processing, the brain's tendency to anticipate sensory input and update its model of the world when predictions fail. Long before humans theorised it, the primate ancestors were living it. Every leap from branch to branch was a test of that model. If the predicted branch bent too far or broke too soon, the brain adjusted the calculation for next time. Survival favoured the best predictors, not the strongest climbers. Social life, too, became a domain of prediction. In the crowded canopy, primates lived in close-knit groups, where cooperation and competition intertwined. To avoid conflict or share food, individuals had to anticipate the actions of others. Mirror neurons, specialised brain cells that fire both when performing an action and when observing another doing the same, likely evolved during this period. These neurons enabled an animal to simulate the behaviour of peers within its own brain. When one primate saw another reach for a fruit, the observer's motor circuits activated as if performing the act. This internal mimicry made coordination and empathy possible. To live socially meant to mirror, to forecast intention. In a world of constant motion, prediction became the currency of intelligence. The primate mind was no longer reacting to the present. It was living slightly ahead of it. Modern studies of monkeys show that their visual and motor cortices can predict the outcome of movement before it happens. Neurons fire in preparation for expected results, sometimes milliseconds in advance. This anticipatory timing is what allows a gibbon to swing at 30 kilometers an hour through gaps larger than its body length without hesitation. The calculation happens beneath awareness, embedded in neural loops that evolved tens of millions of years ago. The forest environment itself may have served as the ultimate evolutionary teacher. Every climb required three-dimensional awareness, balance, and adaptability. Unlike the flat ground where most animals moved in two planes, arboreal life demanded constant recalibration in vertical space. Each step altered the geometry of the world. The result was a brain that could hold multiple frames of reference simultaneously. Where am I now? Where will I be next? And where will others be when I move? This multi-layered cognition became the foundation for complex thought. Long before abstract reasoning, the primate brain mastered dynamic mapping. Play reinforced these abilities. Juvenile primates spent hours chasing, leaping, and wrestling through the canopy, rehearsing movement and prediction without consequence. Play is costly in energy, but it refines neural precision. When young monkeys leap between unstable branches or mimic each other's gestures, their brains are fine-tuning motor control and social timing. In evolutionary terms, play is prediction training disguised as joy. The laughter of modern apes may echo that ancient rehearsal, a sound born not of humour, but of success in anticipating the world's chaos. We can glimpse the legacy of these adaptations in living primates today. A spider monkey's tail grips a branch with the precision of a hand, each movement coordinated with visual feedback. An orangutan studies the flex of a vine before shifting weight, testing its forecast through subtle movement. Even a lemur, when leaping through darkness, judges angles and distance with remarkable accuracy. These skills are inherited not just anatomically but cognitively, a neural lineage that remembers trees as problems to be solved. Fossil evidence from the late Miocene, around 7 million years ago, shows that apes were spreading through diverse environments, from dense forests to open woodlands. This period of ecological fluctuation may have intensified the brain's predictive architecture. As habitats fragmented and climate oscillated, the ability to anticipate change became critical. Those who could adjust quickly, mentally as well as physically, thrived. The predictive brain, forged in the treetops, began to prepare for a world beyond them. It is tempting to romanticize these ancestors as precursors to ourselves, but their intelligence was not ours. It was practical, embodied, immediate. They did not think in words or symbols. They thought in trajectories, in forces, in expected outcomes. To climb was to compute. To leap was to solve an equation. Their neural maps of motion and space were as intricate as any mathematical model, yet entirely unconscious. What makes this story remarkable is how far prediction had come since the first eyes opened hundreds of millions of years earlier. From trilobites detecting shadows to primates forecasting movement, perception had evolved into simulation. The same principle governed all. The brain as a guess-making machine refined by error. In the canopy of ancient Africa, that mechanism reached a new threshold. The primate mind could now predict not just the physical world, but the behaviour of others sharing it. This was the dawn of social foresight, the beginning of empathy, strategy and cooperation. In the quiet of those forests, the seeds of something extraordinary were taking root. A lineage of apes was learning not only to survive in the present, but to live inside the next second, the next move, the next possibility. Every neuron that fired in expectation of a landing point, every glance that anticipated a companion's leap, was a step toward the modern mind. Evolution was building its first true forecaster. If you were to stand among those Miocene trees and watch them move, it would look like chaos, a tangle of bodies, light and motion. But beneath it all was structure, invisible yet precise. Millions of predictions unfolding in harmony. Each jump and grasp was a question answered before it was asked. The forest, in that sense, was not just a habitat. It was the first simulation chamber for intelligence, and in its green labyrinth, the ape who predicted trees was already imagining the future. The night has fallen, and for the first time in the long history of life, something other than the stars begins to glow. In a clearing scattered with bones and dry grass, a small group of early humans, Homo erectus, gathers around a trembling core of light. The flames crackle, rise and breathe, feeding on the air as if alive. Shadows twist across their faces, and the world around them, once endless black, is now a theatre of flickering motion. They are not watching fire. They are seeing through it. Around 2 million years ago, this moment changed the human brain forever. Fire didn't just warm the body, it rewired perception, time, and thought itself. Before this discovery, night was a wall. The eyes of early humans, adapted to the African day, were nearly useless in darkness. Their world followed the rhythm of light. Hunt, feed, flee, rest. Night meant silence and caution. Predators ruled the hours when vision failed. But the control of fire, first as scavenged natural flames and later as tended hearths, fractured that cycle. For the first time, darkness no longer meant danger. It meant something else. Possibility. Light became portable, controllable, intentional. Archaeological evidence suggests that Homo erectus mastered fire use as early as 1.5 million years ago. Charred bones, heat-altered stones, and ash deposits at sites such as 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐿 and 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐿 in Kenya, or 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐿𝐿 Cave in South Africa, point to sustained burning rather than lightning strikes. These weren't accidental blazes, they were maintained fires, fed deliberately, perhaps even protected through the night. To keep fire alive required foresight. To sit by it required patience. In that rhythmic flicker, the brain found something it had never known. Time that could be filled. Fire changed biology first. Exposure to firelight extended waking hours, subtly shifting circadian rhythms that had been anchored to daylight for millions of years. The orange spectrum of flame suppresses melatonin less aggressively than sunlight, but still keeps the brain alert. Evening wakefulness lengthened, and with that wakefulness came something evolutionary time had never tested. Minds awake in the dark, free from the immediate demands of survival. Around the hearth, the brain had hours to wander. In that dim, dynamic light, vision behaved differently. Firelight dances, it doesn't illuminate evenly. Shadows move, edges blur, details emerge and vanish in waves. Neurologically, this triggers the brain's pattern recognition machinery. The visual cortex, wired to predict and interpret movement, begins to invent continuity, faces in the shadows, shapes in the glow, meaning in randomness. To look into fire is to hallucinate safely. It is a simulation chamber powered by chemistry and curiosity. The same neural systems that evolved to track prey or recognize danger now turned inward, finding stories in flame. The interplay between fire and cognition may explain why Homo erectus developed such advanced visual and social awareness compared to earlier hominins. Sitting around a fire meant prolonged face-to-face interaction, something rare in the harsh daylight of hunting or foraging. Firelight emphasizes the eyes. It makes expressions shimmer, gestures vivid, emotions legible. Studies of modern firelight environments show that even today, faces under flame appear more animated, speech more rhythmic, attention more synchronized. For Homo erectus, this nightly illumination may have trained neural circuits for empathy and anticipation. The flicker of the flames mirrored the flicker of thought. The smell and sound of fire also carried information. Burning wood released complex aromas that signaled safety, predators avoided it, and warmth. The crackling rhythm may have become the first metronome for communication. It provided background regularity against which vocalization or laughter could emerge without startling the group. Some researchers propose that this kind of rhythmic auditory environment encouraged early forms of social cohesion. Fire, in essence, set the tempo for tribe and thought alike. The act of maintaining fire also demanded a new kind of attention. To keep it burning required planning, coordination, and division of tasks. Someone had to gather fuel, someone to guard the embers, someone to watch the surroundings. This shared vigilance was a rehearsal for collective focus, a neurological exercise in sustained cooperation. The fire became both a tool and a teacher, shaping behaviour around its needs. It demanded continuity, and in return it provided security and light. As Homo erectus spread beyond Africa into cooler latitudes, fire became even more vital. It allowed survival in environments that would have been lethal without warmth or cooking. But cooking itself, though transformative, was only one aspect. Heat softened meat, released calories, and reduced chewing time, giving energy to a growing brain. Yet what fire did for the mind was subtler. It gave the imagination room to stretch. With longer evenings, vision illuminated by dancing light, and fewer immediate dangers, the neural machinery of dreaming and prediction found a stage outside of sleep. Neuroscientists today note that the human visual system is deeply responsive to fluctuating luminance. Firelight, unlike sunlight, is irregular. It produces low-frequency oscillations that engage the brain's alpha waves, inducing calm alertness. This state, neither fully awake nor asleep, may have encouraged introspection and associative thinking. Around a campfire, the boundaries between external perception and internal thought blur. The fire becomes a mirror for the mind, reflecting imagined scenes as much as real ones. For early humans, this might have been the first step toward a narrative rehearsal, replaying the day's events, imagining hunts, remembering paths, or predicting tomorrow's encounters. In that sense, fire didn't just extend the day, it extended consciousness. The world was no longer divided strictly between action and rest. There was now a third space, reflection. Sitting by the flames, Homo erectus could watch movement without moving, perceive without reacting, and think without acting. This stillness, illuminated by shifting light, became the birthplace of contemplation. The same predictive circuits used for navigation and hunting were now being repurposed for internal simulation. The brain had begun to rehearse the world in the glow of its own creation. The social consequences of this are difficult to overstate. Fire created circles, literal ones. Individuals gathered at a focal point sharing heat and attention. This physical configuration reinforced group identity and memory. Archaeological hearths found at sites such as 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐓 in Israel, dating to nearly 800,000 years ago, show evidence of repeated use. Layers of ash, burned flint, and plant material carefully arranged. These were not random burn sites. They were persistent meeting places, centres of nightly return. Fire turned space into meaning. It also redefined the night sky. Before fire, darkness was total. Stars were distant, abstract. But with fire came contrast. The flicker of flame against blackness made the heavens seem alive, moving, reactive. Perhaps this interplay of near and far light stimulated a new scale of thinking. The mind, accustomed to short horizons, could now measure itself against distance and time. Each spark mirrored the stars above, linking the earthly to the cosmic in the first silent analogy. What did early humans see when they stared into those flames? They saw motion without threat, change without consequence, light that breathed like a living thing. Their visual systems, fine-tuned for prediction, played endlessly with the fire's uncertainty. Faces emerged, vanished, reappeared. Shadows behaved like spirits of movement. The fire became a kind of natural cinema, replaying the patterns of the world in miniature. Around it, thought learned to flow beyond the immediate. Evidence of ash and soot inside caves, such as Wonderwerk, tells us that Homo erectus was not merely an opportunist, but a caretaker of fire. The layers of sediment there show repeated use over long spans, suggesting that fire was carried and maintained rather than rediscovered anew each time. This persistence implies more than practical knowledge. It implies cultural continuity. Fire became the first inheritance that could be shared not by genes, but by teaching. Over generations, this nightly ritual must have transformed communication. Watching others by firelight sharpened sensitivity to gesture and tone. Heat and light brought people physically closer, fostering trust and exchange. Firelight extended the sensory intimacy of day into the hours of dark, binding the group through shared experience. The circle of flame was also the first shared frame of attention, a prototype for storytelling, for teaching, for passing knowledge from one to another without the need for immediate utility. To sit in the dark and watch fire is to confront something hypnotic, yet deeply familiar. Modern studies of light and brain activity reveal that the dynamic unpredictability of flame reduces anxiety, lowers heart rate, and increases social calm. It triggers oxytocin release, the same hormone linked to bonding and empathy. Whether by biology or memory, we are still wired to feel safe beside a fire. Perhaps that response was born in those early nights, when Homo erectus learned to pair light with belonging. We cannot know what thoughts passed through their minds, but we can imagine what the evidence implies. They had the time, the focus, and the sensory conditions to begin forming internal narratives, sequences of events not immediately visible. Around the fire, life gained a dimension beyond reaction. A mind that once lived entirely in the moment could now stretch into the near future, replay the recent past, and reflect upon both. Fire taught the brain to linger. When the flames died and darkness returned, that memory remained. Even unlit, the hearth was a marker of potential light, a promise that night was no longer an end but an interval. Fire's glow had changed not just the landscape, but the rhythm of being. The day no longer ended when the sun fell. The brain had been gifted a new kind of time, the slow hours between exhaustion and sleep, where imagination could take root. And so, in the long quiet of those Pleistocene nights, Homo erectus stared into a mirror made of flame and discovered movement that came from nowhere, patterns that belonged to no predator or prey. The fire spoke in shadows, and the brain learned to listen. For perhaps the first time, life on Earth experienced awareness illuminated by something it had itself created. A single hand, rough and scarred from years of work, lifts a river stone and turns it under the light. The creature holding it, Homo erectus, sees not what it is, but what it could become. With a few precise blows, the outer layer will flake away to reveal a shape already alive inside the mind. Strike too hard and it shatters. Strike too soft and nothing changes. The rhythm is learned through repetition, through failure. Slowly, from the patient dialogue between hand and stone, something entirely new begins to emerge, not just a tool, but a way of thinking. Around 700,000 years ago, this process became one of the earliest external forms of memory. The stone was not just an object. It was thought made visible. Archaeologists call these tools 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐿, after the site of Saint-Étienne in France, where they were first recognised. They appear across Africa, Europe and Asia, spanning hundreds of thousands of years. Each one, whether made from flint, quartzite or basalt, carries the same unmistakable form, a teardrop shape, symmetrical, balanced, often elegant in its precision. These were not random flakes broken by instinctive blows. They were planned, deliberate and standardized across continents, a technological tradition older than any language. To create one required a brain that could imagine a shape hidden within another, anticipate the consequences of force, and repeat a procedure through time. When we study these hand axes, we're not just studying artifacts. We're looking at the fossilized trace of thought. To make such a tool, the maker needed to hold multiple steps in working memory. Selecting a suitable stone, striking it from the correct angle, rotating it systematically, maintaining symmetry from both sides. Each action depended on the memory of the last, guided by the vision of a form that did not yet exist. This is what archaeologists mean by mental template, an abstract model of the finished tool guiding every strike. It was the birth of procedural imagination, a kind of slow-motion foresight written into stone. Neuroscientists today recognize that such behavior demands integration between visual, motor, and prefrontal regions of the brain. When a modern person knaps stone experimentally, the left hemisphere, especially Broca's area, later linked to speech, shows high activity. This suggests that long before humans spoke, our ancestors were already sequencing actions in structured hierarchical patterns. In shaping stone, they were rehearsing the mental architecture that would one day allow language and planning. The 𝐓𝐓𝐿𝐿 toolmaker was not just using hands, they were using syntax made physical. The earliest 𝐓𝐓𝐿𝐿 tools appear in Africa around 1.5 million years ago, but by 700,000 years ago they reached a level of refinement that suggests teaching, imitation, and shared standards. At sites like 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐿 in Kenya or Boxgrove in England, the ground is littered with dozens of nearly identical hand axes, each symmetrical, each struck with practiced control. These were not isolated innovations. They were part of a cognitive lineage. To reproduce a shape, this consistently requires not just perception, but feedback, a brain comparing the present outcome to an internal goal. Every flake removed was a conversation between expectation and result. We can imagine the rhythm of that work, the steady percussion of stone against stone, the inspection between strikes, the slight tilt of the head in assessment. Each maker likely learned by watching another, their brains wired to mirror and refine. This is the same neural mechanism that allows imitation in primates and empathy in humans. The mirror neuron system, which activates when we observe others performing actions, would have made teaching by demonstration possible. Knowledge could now pass visually, through gesture and rhythm rather than instinct. The technique was not just physical, it was cultural. What is most striking about 𝐓𝐿𝐼𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒 technology is its stability. For more than 1 million years, this same basic design persisted across continents and generations. Some interpret this as stagnation, but perhaps it was perfection. The hand axe was an adaptable multi-purpose tool, a knife, a hammer, a digger. Yet its longevity also suggests something else, that cognition was becoming externalized. The knowledge of how to make one did not need to live entirely inside the brain. It was embedded in the rhythm of the work, the shape of the object, the tradition of imitation. The stone itself became a form of stored information, an external memory system long before writing. To shape stone is to create feedback loops. The maker acts, perceives the result, and adjusts. Over time, this cycle strengthens neural pathways linking action and evaluation. In modern neuroscience, this process underlies skill learning and procedural memory. But for Homo erectus, it was something more profound. The first material expression of intentional design. Each completed hand axe was both a product and a teacher. When another picked it up, they could infer the sequence of blows that produced it, the intention behind its balance, the vision behind its symmetry. It was a conversation through deep time, knowledge encoded in geometry. The degree of standardization implies that 𝐓𝐿𝐼𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒 toolmakers were capable of abstract goals, maintaining symmetry for its own sake beyond immediate utility. Experiments show that even trained modern humans require hours of practice to produce a true biface. The sequence of strikes must be executed in a precise order, first roughing out the shape, then thinning the edges, then refining the point. Each step anticipates the next, demanding spatial reasoning and forward modelling. The brain, in effect, runs a simulation before each strike, predicting where the flake will fall. When the strike aligns with expectation, a feedback signal of success strengthens the pattern. When it fails, adjustment follows. In this way, each hand axe records the evolution of a brain learning from itself. Firelight likely played a role in this learning process too. Evidence from sites such as 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒 suggests that stone tools and hearths often coexisted. Working by firelight would have enhanced focus and extended working hours into evening, allowing observation and correction under controlled light. It also brought the social element, shared attention, teaching moments, and collective rhythm. The flickering light on stone may even have helped the brain recognize shape and symmetry, the same way moving shadows reveal form. Fire and stone became partners in cognitive expansion. 𝐓𝐿𝐼𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒 craftsmanship also reveals an early sense of aesthetics, not in the artistic sense, but in the recognition of balance and proportion. Some hand axes are polished to unnecessary smoothness, others perfectly symmetrical beyond function. This suggests a reward system in the brain linked not just to utility, but to pattern recognition. To create symmetry and recognize it as right engages the same neural circuits modern humans use for visual pleasure and order. The satisfaction of a well-made tool was likely emotional as much as practical. The brain, it seems, had begun to take joy in its own precision. At sites like Kalambo Falls or Isampur, archaeologists have discovered large workshop areas filled with flakes, cores and discarded attempts, a prehistoric classroom of trial and error. The scatter of debris tells a story of repetition, correction, and improvement. The ground itself becomes a fossilized record of learning. Each imperfect piece is a neuron misfiring and then adapting, a tangible record of cognition refining itself through failure. When we look at those stones, we are watching thought evolve, one strike at a time. There is also evidence that 𝐓𝐿𝐼𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒 toolmakers selected raw materials with care, choosing stones that fractured predictably. This implies knowledge of geological properties and long-term planning, as some materials had to be transported kilometres from their source. To carry stone is to plan for future need, to hold potential in one's hands. The mental link between now and later, the foundation of delayed gratification, was taking form. In the act of shaping stone, Homo erectus externalized parts of the cognitive load that earlier species kept internal. The tool became an extension of memory and problem-solving. Once a standard existed, it could be consulted visually rather than reconstructed mentally. The world itself became a library of solutions. This dynamic, offloading thought into material form, is the essence of technology. Every object created to make life easier also changes how the brain thinks about difficulty. The 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐿 revolution was not about invention. It was about the feedback between brain and matter, between action and reflection. If we could stand beside one of those early toolmakers, the scene would look deceptively simple. A figure crouched near a riverbank surrounded by shards, eyes narrowing with concentration. Each sound of stone meeting stone echoes like heartbeat and metronome. But beneath that rhythm lies something profound. A brain editing itself through interaction with the world. The hand axe, in this sense, was both product and teacher. With every strike, the brain learned not only how to make a tool, but how to think procedurally, to structure time into sequences, to connect intention with execution. By 300,000 years ago, 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐿 technology was giving way to more regional and specialized tool traditions. But its cognitive legacy endured. It taught the human lineage how to see potential, how to rehearse a process mentally before acting, how to remember by doing. These are the same foundations that underlie design, engineering, and art today. The stone that remembered was not the tool, it was the mind that made it, reshaped by the act of creation. If we trace the line from those ancient riverbanks to modern hands, the pattern remains. We think through our tools, and our tools in turn think through us. The first hammerstone was not the birth of technology, but the birth of a conversation, a loop between brain and world that continues every time we shape something into meaning. The fire has burned low, the night is quiet, and someone stares too long into the coals. The heat warps the air, the charred wood shifts and glows. For an instant there's a flicker, a suggestion of eyes, a nose, a mouth forming in the embers. The brain catches it before the mind can resist. A face, there, in the flames. Then it's gone, just heat and motion again. But the image lingers. Around 200,000 years ago, this was not madness or superstition. It was biology. Seeing faces where none exist was not a flaw. It was survival. Every creature on Earth evolves to detect what matters most. For us, that was other people. Before words, before stories, before culture, life depended on reading the smallest cues. An expression, a twitch, a change in direction. A heartbeat of hesitation could mean the difference between alliance and threat. The human brain, shaped by millions of years of social living, became exquisitely sensitive to the pattern of a face. 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth, aligned just so. It learned to extract meaning from that pattern faster than from any other. And it did so whether the pattern was real or not. Neuroscientists call this tendency pareidolia. The spontaneous recognition of familiar forms in random stimuli, clouds that look like animals, rocks that resemble heads, shadows that move like figures. It's a universal quirk of perception, one that has existed since the first Homo sapiens looked at fire, sky, and stone, and saw something looking back. The roots of this bias stretch deep into our evolutionary past, long before art or belief. It emerged because false positives were safer than false negatives. To imagine a face in the dark and be wrong costs nothing. To miss a predator or a person and be wrong could cost everything. Studies of modern human vision reveal how deeply this bias is wired. Within milliseconds, the fusiform face area, a specialized region in the temporal lobe, activates at the mere suggestion of facial structure. Even simple geometric patterns like 3 dots arranged as eyes and a mouth trigger the same neural response as a real face. This system doesn't wait for confirmation. It assumes, it predicts, it fills in. The same machinery that makes us recognize loved ones across a crowd also makes us see ghosts and shadows. In evolutionary terms, this was efficient. The Pleistocene landscape was full of ambiguous signals, shifting light through leaves, rustling grass, distant movement at dusk. The mind that could quickly impose meaning on that chaos gained a crucial advantage. Better to imagine a watcher than to be unaware of one. The hypersocial brain, tuned to perceive agency everywhere, began to interpret not just motion but intention in its surroundings. When the wind moved branches, it might not just be wind, it might mean something. This perceptual overreach wasn't limited to vision. Our ancestors' auditory systems were just as sensitive to agency. A crack in the dark could sound like footsteps. An echo might be heard as a voice. The brain learned to pair ambiguous sensory input with possible actors. It was a constant guessing game between noise and narrative. Modern cognitive science describes this as a predictive loop. The brain's attempt to minimize uncertainty by generating explanations faster than it receives data. For early humans, this loop was survival's operating system. The cost of such hypervigilance was illusion. The benefit was connection. By constantly assuming that movement and sound came from living agents, early humans built the first neural scaffolding of empathy. To survive, they had to anticipate the intentions of others. This demanded a simulation of minds, an ability to imagine what another being might see, think, or feel. What began as a defensive reflex evolved into a social intuition so powerful that it sometimes misfired. Even now we attribute thought to inanimate things, a stubborn computer, a sad-looking tree, a stone that waits. Our brains have never stopped projecting life. Around the hearths of the late Middle Pleistocene, this bias met new sensory conditions. Firelight changed how faces appeared. It cast dynamic shadows, exaggerated features, and made emotion visible long into the night. The human face under fire is not static. It flickers between familiarity and distortion. Sitting in circles, our ancestors would have seen each other's expressions shift constantly, as if animated by unseen forces. The mind learned to read these fluctuations with increasing nuance. Eye contact, once fleeting in daylight, became electric under flame. In that glow, empathy found its first laboratory. This was also when human populations grew larger and more socially complex. Living in groups meant constant monitoring of others' moods, alliances, and signals. Those who excelled at this, who could detect anger, fear, or approval before words, had better reproductive success. Natural selection favoured not just intelligence, but emotional precision. The same neural circuits that helped identify danger evolved to decode subtle human cues, but they also remained prone to false alarms. The cost of being social was being haunted by the possibility of presence. Even today, the pareidolia reflex is most vivid under conditions of low light and fatigue, the same environment our ancestors faced each night. Under firelight or moonlight, the brain operates between vision and imagination. Shadows fuse into shapes. Faces emerge from randomness. The transition from wakefulness to sleep, the hypnagogic state, often brings vivid visual distortions. For Pleistocene humans, these moments between focus and dream blurred the boundary between outer world and inner model. Firelight, flickering at the edge of awareness, may have been the first teacher of that boundary. Neuropsychological studies show that pareidolia arises not from perception itself, but from the brain's interpretive overdrive. The visual cortex processes patterns, while higher regions, like the prefrontal cortex, evaluate meaning. When sensory input is ambiguous, the predictive model fills gaps with expectation. In social species like ours, expectation defaults to faces and agents. This is why we see personalities in clouds or emotions in random noise. The social brain cannot tolerate neutrality. It demands story even in stillness. But there was another consequence to this bias. Empathy extended beyond what was alive. To see agency where none existed was to practice compassion toward the imagined. This capacity to attribute feeling to things that did not have it may have softened social cohesion itself. A species that could misperceive faces could also care for strangers. The neurological mechanism of error became the foundation of morality. We evolved to overconnect rather than underconnect. The archaeological record of this period hints at growing symbolic awareness, though not yet art. Acheulean tools were becoming more refined, pigments occasionally appear in sites, and personal ornaments, though rare, begin to emerge later. But before symbols there was this, the readiness to project meaning outward, to see faces and patterns everywhere. This perceptual generosity created the mental soil from which symbolic thought would eventually grow. The mind was learning not just to see the world, but to imagine it as inhabited. Consider the landscape itself through those ancient eyes. The moonlit rock face might seem to watch back. The fire crackles with voices. The shifting pattern of leaves resembles movement. These were not primitive misunderstandings. They were the inevitable results of a predictive social brain operating in uncertainty. The environment became animated by perception itself. The same circuits that once tracked predators now filled the night with presence. The line between self and world blurred. The forest breathed with imagined intent. This evolutionary bias persists in modern life. Infants prefer face-like stimuli within hours of birth. Adults see emotion in cars, animals, or emojis. We're so attuned to social signals that we project them everywhere, even onto technology. In the deep past, this would have meant survival through constant vigilance. In the modern world, it means loneliness eased by imagination. The same neural reflex that once guarded us from predators now guards us from isolation. What is remarkable is how early this system appears in our lineage. Comparative studies of great apes show some face detection abilities, but none as exaggerated as ours. Somewhere between the emergence of Homo erectus and early Homo sapiens, perception crossed a threshold. The brain began not only to detect faces, but to find meaning in their absence. This was more than pattern recognition. It was proto-empathy, a rehearsal for social understanding. To stare into fire and find a face was to experience a projection of one's own mind. The brain created the illusion, then reacted emotionally to it. That feedback loop, seeing and feeling simultaneously, was a small but critical step toward introspection. Awareness of illusion is awareness of perception itself. The flames that once scared animals away were now scaring ideas into existence. Around the campfires of Pleistocene nights, early humans practiced this unintentional art of projection. They didn't yet tell stories or carve images, but they saw. They saw faces in wood, in smoke, in the patterns of embers, and in each other. They lived in a world half real, half imagined, because evolution found that seeing too much was safer than seeing too little. The mind had learned to err on the side of empathy. In that sense, pareidolia was not a mistake, but a miracle. It made us cautious, social, creative, and compassionate. It was the mind's first experiment in seeing beyond evidence. When a face flickered in the fire, it was not superstition. It was the brain rehearsing the future, practicing awareness of awareness. The world looked back because we needed it to. And so the fires of 200,000 years ago didn't just burn wood, They illuminated the inside of perception. The eyes that saw faces in the flames were the same eyes that would one day paint them on cave walls, but for now there were only shadows and light, and the endless conversation between what was real and what we needed to believe was watching. The night is long, the wind soft, and a young woman sits by the fading fire. In her hand she holds a small piece of ochre, rubbed smooth from use. She drags it across her skin, leaving a dark red streak along her arm. It means nothing, yet it feels like something. Around her, others sleep, dream, or whisper. The stars above are motionless, but in her mind images stir. She remembers a hunt, a storm, a shadow, a pattern that feels familiar but isn't there. In that quiet moment, around 100,000 years ago, the human mind began to see more than it could touch. Imagination had crossed into waking life. Before there were stories, there were dreams. For millions of years, sleep had been a safe rehearsal, a place where the brain replayed movement and fear. But something began to change within our lineage. The neural circuits that generated dream imagery, those same rapid-fire bursts of simulated experience, started to activate during the day. The boundary between night and waking began to blur. Homo sapiens, newly emerged and spreading across Africa, began to carry the dream outward. What had once been confined to darkness began to stain the daylight in colour and form. Archaeologists see this transition not in words or drawings, but in objects. The first traces of symbolic behaviour appear around this time. Small pieces of red ochre carved with deliberate lines, shells drilled for stringing, fragments of pigment ground smooth, as if for painting bodies or objects. None of these things were useful in the practical sense. They did not kill prey or start fires. They served something more abstract, the need to mark, remember, or imagine. It was the first evidence that humans were thinking beyond the immediate extending thought into representation. Red ochre is especially telling. Across early human sites in Africa and the Near East, it appears again and again, rubbed on stone tools, scattered on bones stored in small piles. Chemically, it is iron oxide, a mineral found naturally in soil and rock. But to the early human eye, it was colour, vivid, lasting, unlike anything in nature's usual palette of brown and grey. Grinding ochre required patience and vision. It was the first transformation of the Earth's surface into pigment, and perhaps the first time a human intentionally changed the appearance of the world. What could have driven this? One possibility is that the same neural networks that evolved for dreaming, the spontaneous activation of visual memory, emotion, and association, began to operate in waking consciousness. The prefrontal cortex, which normally suppresses free-flowing imagery during the day, might have relaxed its boundaries under certain conditions, fatigue, ritual, or social focus. The result was a kind of controlled hallucination, a visualization of meaning projected onto reality. To decorate the body, to mark a surface, was to externalize that vision. The brain was learning to paint its thoughts onto the world. The use of beads tells a similar story. Small marine shells, often found far inland, were drilled and worn, sometimes in clusters, sometimes singly. To collect, modify and wear such objects required foresight and repetition. The holes were made carefully, often in identical places. This precision suggests a shared understanding of what the object represented. It was not random decoration. It was a sign, a portable symbol of connection or identity. For the first time, meaning could be carried on the body. This act of adornment was not trivial. It signalled a leap from cognition to metacognition, from experiencing to expressing. To wear a bead is to say, I know I am seen. It transforms the self from invisible to visible, from individual to social statement. Evolutionarily, this may have strengthened group cohesion. In harsh and shifting climates, belonging could mean survival. The use of colour and ornament became a visual shorthand for identity, trust, and memory. But it also gave birth to a new kind of mental experience, the awareness of being observed. Neuroscience suggests that imagination, empathy, and social modelling share overlapping brain networks, particularly in the default mode system, the regions active when the mind wanders. When early humans began using pigment and ornament, they were not just experimenting with aesthetics, they were experimenting with introspection. They were using external cues to access internal states, much like how dreams use images to process emotion. The dreaming circuitry of the brain had found a new canvas, the skin. What's extraordinary about this period is the consistency of such behaviour across different regions. Similar pigment use and ornamentation appear across Africa, the Levant, and even parts of early Eurasia. This suggests not a single innovation, but a convergent awakening. The cognitive architecture of symbolic thought had matured. The brain could now manipulate images untethered from direct experience. It could imagine the unseen, and more importantly, believe in it. The origin of this capacity likely lies in the blending of two older systems, the visual simulation of REM sleep and the predictive modelling of waking perception. The human brain is a prediction machine. It constantly generates expectations about the world and updates them through sensory feedback. Dreams are what happens when the feedback stops, but the prediction continues. In imagination, that same process occurs while awake. The difference is control. To imagine deliberately is to guide the dream rather than be swept by it. When we imagine, the same regions light up as when we perceive. The occipital cortex for vision, the parietal for spatial awareness, the limbic system for emotion. In other words, the brain does not distinguish sharply between seeing and imagining. For our ancestors, this overlap may have blurred the boundary between memory and creation. The pigment on the skin could symbolize a hunt, a storm, or a kinship bond. But it might also have simply felt right, a material reflection of an inner image. This ability to project inner vision outward changed how humans interacted with time. Dreams are timeless. Imagination made time malleable. One could now recall the past, envision the future, and represent both through signs. Pigments and beads became markers of memory and intention, anchoring transient thought in tangible form. They were external neurons extending cognition into matter, much as hand axes once extended planning into motion. The difference was that now the subject of thought was not survival itself, but meaning. From an evolutionary psychology perspective, imagination likely offered immediate adaptive benefits. It allowed for rehearsal of scenarios without real-world risk, planning of hunts or migrations, and understanding of others' motives through simulated perspective-taking. But alongside these advantages came byproducts: dreamlike creativity, aesthetic curiosity, and even irrational beliefs. Evolution rarely designs single-purpose tools. It co-opts and reuses. Imagination was perhaps one of those accidents that stayed because it worked. The physical evidence of imagination's rise is small but profound. Pigment pieces with wear patterns suggest mixing or application. Perforated shells show stringing, an act that required dexterity and repetition. Engraved lines on ochre blocks reveal a sense of composition, straight, deliberate, repeated. None of this was necessary for survival, yet the persistence of such acts across tens of thousands of years shows they served something essential to the human mind: the need to see the invisible. In the deep glow of a campfire, these decorated bodies must have shimmered like moving symbols. Red pigment caught the light, beads rattled softly against skin. To an observer, such appearances carried both familiarity and mystery. Each pattern might have meant kinship, memory, or simply beauty. The visual cortex of the watcher, evolved to detect significance in form and colour, would have responded automatically, reinforcing social and emotional connection. In this way, imagination became contagious. To see another's decoration was to participate in their inner world. We can think of this as the birth of the dreaming animal, a species capable of blending inner and outer reality. The dreaming animal sees not just what is, but what could be. It overlays perception with projection, turning existence into narrative. This blending may explain why humans so easily drift between imagination, belief, and perception even today. Our consciousness evolved not to see the world as it is, but as it might become. By 60,000 years ago, this capacity had matured into a defining trait. Symbolic expression became embedded in daily life. Body painting, ornamentation, selective collection of rare materials. These were not isolated experiments. They were habits of mind, practiced over generations until they became instinct. The human brain, once content to respond, now required creation. The dream had stepped fully into daylight. When we look back across this timeline, it's tempting to call it progress. But the reality is subtler. Imagination was never guaranteed to improve survival. It carried costs, distraction, delusion, obsession. Yet its persistence shows that the benefits outweighed the risks. The dreaming animal could adapt faster, cooperate better, and endure longer because it could envision alternatives. Imagination became evolution's secret engine, a mutation of perception that allowed reality to expand beyond its edges. So, did imagination begin as a tool or a side effect? Perhaps both. It was the side effect that became the tool, the dream that learned to plan. And though we now carry it effortlessly, it remains a fragile inheritance. Each time we imagine, we reenact that first quiet experiment by the fire, turning pigment into memory, dream into form. The line between what is real and what is imagined has never been clear, and that may be the most human thing about us. A torch flickers against a stone wall deep underground. The air is still and heavy, thick with the scent of smoke and mineral dust. A hand moves slowly across the surface, tracing the curve of a bison's flank or the arc of a running horse. The flame trembles, and for a moment the image seems to move, to breathe. Shadows shift, pigments shimmer, and the watcher's mind fills in the rest. Around 40,000 years ago, somewhere in the darkness of a cave, the human brain began to paint not just what it saw, but what it remembered, what it imagined, and what it could almost see. This was not decoration. It was perception made visible. Long before the first stroke of ochre touched stone, the human visual system had been refining itself for millions of years. The retina, the optic nerve, the visual cortex, all evolved to turn light into meaning. But something changed in Homo sapiens. The brain stopped waiting for the world to provide input. It began to generate its own. When the first humans entered caves and started painting, they weren't recording what stood before them. They were externalizing what their minds already projected inwardly. The walls became mirrors for thought, extensions of the visual cortex. Cognitive archaeology and neuroaesthetics both point toward this transition as a moment of neurological feedback, a loop between internal imagery and external material. The painters of places like Chauvet and Lascaux were not simply copying animals they saw in daylight. They were manipulating the architecture of their own perception. The cave, with its irregular surfaces and dim, flickering light, acted as an amplifier of the mind's tendency to complete patterns. In near darkness, the visual cortex enters a suggestible state. Random cracks become outlines. Shadows resemble movement. When pigment fills those shapes, the illusion stabilizes. The result is less an artwork than a hallucination shared between mind and environment. Modern brain imaging offers clues to how this may have felt. When people enter trance-like or meditative states, through rhythmic movement, flickering light, or controlled breathing, activity in the primary visual cortex, the V1 area at the back of the brain, increases even without external stimulation. Geometric patterns, spirals, dots and waves are the first to appear. Neuroscientists call these entoptic phenomena, generated by the brain's own visual wiring. Under torchlight, those same patterns may have appeared on cave walls naturally, dancing with the flicker of flame. Early humans didn't invent the imagery, they revealed it. The surfaces of caves such as Lascaux, Altamira and Sulawesi seem almost chosen for their organic geometry. The artists used bulges, hollows and cracks to give shape to animals already half present in the stone. A curve became the back of an aurochs, a crevice became the mouth of a horse, a protrusion became the shoulder of a mammoth. This technique, known to archaeologists as mimetic enhancement, shows a deep understanding of visual psychology. The painter didn't need to depict the entire form. The brain of the observer would complete it automatically. It's the same mechanism behind modern pareidolia, the tendency to see faces in clouds or fire, except now it was being harnessed intentionally. This was perception becoming collaborative. The painter and the viewer shared a single hallucination stabilized by pigment. Each line of ochre or charcoal acted as an anchor, holding the image still long enough for both to agree it existed. The neural pathways of pattern recognition and prediction, designed for survival in the wild, were now being used for creation in darkness. In a way, the cave wall was an extension of the occipital lobe, the world's first neural screen. Why caves? Partly because they provided sensory isolation. Step a few meters into the dark and the outside world disappears. The acoustics amplify breath and heartbeat. Light becomes scarce, forcing the visual system into hypersensitivity. In this state, even the faintest glow produces exaggerated contrasts. Under such conditions, the line between internal and external perception blurs. Modern experiments with flickering lights and low-frequency sound show similar effects. Spontaneous pattern formation, motion perception, and visual hallucination. Our ancestors didn't need complex rituals to access altered states. The cave itself was the mechanism. Once the imagery began, something remarkable followed. Repetition. The same animal forms appear across continents: horses, bison, deer, lions, mammoths. These were not random choices. They were the most visually and emotionally charged creatures of the Pleistocene world. To see them was to feel survival itself. The brain's limbic system, responsible for emotion and memory, lit up at their sight. When those same forms were reproduced in pigment, the emotional circuits responded as if encountering the real animal. Painting was not a detached observation. It was a full sensory simulation. Neuroarchaeologists argue that the act of painting itself may have been self-reinforcing. When an artist draws the brain's mirror neuron system, the network that maps observed and performed action, activates as though performing the movement being depicted. To draw a running horse is to internally feel the rhythm of its stride. This link between gesture and imagery would have made painting both immersive and addictive. The brain rewarded the act of simulation because it strengthened predictive accuracy. The ability to imagine motion, weight, and form before action. In that sense, painting was a kind of cognitive training, a way to refine the mind's internal model of the world. Some researchers, like David Lewis Williams and Clive Gamble, propose that the cave paintings represent an extension of the dreaming circuitry into the waking state. During REM sleep, the visual cortex and limbic system activate while the prefrontal cortex, the seat of rational control, quiets down. The result is vivid, emotionally charged imagery unconstrained by logic. In the half-light of a cave, under rhythmic flicker and echo, the same pattern may have repeated, the sensory brain active, the critical brain subdued. To paint, then, might have been to dream with open eyes, to stabilize transient images from the mind's edge before they faded. The neurological evidence supports this. Studies show that when modern artists enter deep focus, their alpha wave activity increases similar to meditative or hypnagogic states. The boundaries between self and task dissolve. Time perception warps. The act of creation becomes its own form of trance. Early humans, painting by torchlight, may have experienced something similar. A state where imagination and perception merge so seamlessly that distinctions cease to matter. The pigments themselves added another layer of feedback. Ochre, charcoal, and manganese dioxide are not inert materials. Their textures, smells, and resistance to the hand stimulate sensory neurons. To grind pigment, to mix it with saliva or fat, to smear it across rough stone. Each step engages tactile and olfactory memory. The artist's entire body participates in the act. This embodied process strengthens the link between action and image. The wall becomes not just a surface, but a record of touch. At Lascaux, the artists used scaffolds to reach high vaults, indicating premeditation and teamwork. At Chauvet, overlapping drawings suggest a deliberate use of palimpsest. Old images reused as foundations for new ones, as though memory itself were layered. At Sulawesi, hand stencils and animal outlines coexist, each echoing the presence of the maker. The handprints, blown around with pigment, are not signatures. They are sensory imprints, evidence of contact between mind and world. When we look at them today, our brains react as if we are seeing another person's gesture frozen in motion. The temporal distance collapses. We experience recognition across tens of thousands of years. One of the most intriguing findings in neuroscience is that when people view ancient art, the same brain regions activate as when they view modern images of movement and life. The visual cortex responds to contour and contrast, while the superior temporal sulcus interprets implied motion. This means the caves still work. They still trigger the same perceptual circuits they did 40 millennia ago. The art is not static, it is interactive, dependent on human perception to complete it. So why did humans start painting what they could already see? Perhaps because they wanted to see it again, but differently. Memory fades. Perception is fleeting. By translating it into pigment, they could hold the ephemeral still. The brain's predictive model of reality, always updating, always anticipating, could now project itself outward and stabilize its own imagination. Painting was the brain making peace with impermanence, and yet there's an even subtler function. In painting, humans learned to watch themselves seeing. To reproduce the world required noticing how vision actually worked, how edges define form, how light and shadow create depth, how movement can be implied by curve. Every image was also an experiment in perception. The painted mind was not content to receive reality, it wanted to understand it. This self-referential awareness may have been the spark that pushed cognition into self-consciousness. To paint something external is to acknowledge an internal witness, an eye observing. When those early artists lifted their torches to inspect their work, they were not just evaluating technique. They were confronting evidence of their own perception, externalized and enduring. In the wavering light, they saw what their own minds could invent, and that realization must have been as haunting as it was beautiful. By 30,000 years ago, this behavior had spread across continents, from Europe to Asia to the islands of Southeast Asia. Each site shows the same astonishing sophistication, deliberate composition, layered perspective, dynamic motion. This was no longer practice. It was mastery of perception itself. The human brain, evolved for survival, had begun to turn inward, using its predictive machinery to model not just the external world, but its own imagination. When the torchlight flickered across those painted walls, something profound was happening in the visual cortex of both maker and observer. They were sharing a hallucination, an agreement between minds across time and space. The brain, once confined to the skull, had expanded into the stone. The caves remain silent today, their pigments still clinging to rock that remembers the warmth of hands long vanished. Yet each time we light them again, we recreate the experiment. The figures move, the shadows dance. The brain awakens the same patterns it evolved to trust. Perhaps that's why these images still affect us so deeply, because they are not just art, but the residue of perception itself. The first painters did not need to invent imagination. They only needed to follow where their own vision led. In those deep chambers of sound and shadow, humanity met its own mind and found it already full of pictures. A group gathers beside the embers of a dying fire, faces half-lit, bodies drawn close against the cold. The night is long, and the world beyond the glow is filled with unseen things, predators, spirits, memories, and dreams. One voice begins to speak. The words rise and fall like the rhythm of breath, carrying images into the dark. The hunt, the mountain, the great animal that lived before the flood. The others listen, eyes fixed not on the speaker, but on something invisible that forms between them. For the first time in history, reality is not only what is seen, it is what is said. Around 25,000 years ago, language transformed the human mind from a solitary witness into a shared dreamer. Long before words, humans had sound. Cries of warning, calls of affection, rhythmic chants that echoed heartbeat and motion. But sound without syntax is signal, not structure. The emergence of complex grammar, rules linking who, what and when, allowed thoughts to leave one mind and reconstruct themselves inside another. Syntax made imagination contagious. A story could now jump from voice to ear to memory, binding people together not by sight, but by shared mental simulation. The same neural circuits that once predicted a leaping predator now predicted invisible worlds. Cognitive linguistics tells us that language does not simply describe reality, it generates it. Words are models, compressed maps of experience that guide perception. When early humans began linking nouns to verbs, they created sequences of cause and effect. The lion hunts the gazelle. The child sleeps near the fire. These were not just observations, they were rehearsals of possible worlds. To speak a sentence was to simulate an event in another person's mind. It was collaborative hallucination, powered by grammar. The biological machinery for this feat was ancient. The Broca's and Wernicke's areas of the brain, essential for speech production and comprehension, are connected by a thick bundle of nerve fibres called the arcuate fasciculus. In earlier hominins, these regions already showed signs of growth, perhaps used for planning complex tool sequences or coordinating group hunts. But in Homo sapiens, the connection exploded in density. The brain was no longer just representing movement, it was representing relationships, intentions, and hypothetical outcomes. Language became the nervous system of collective thought. What changed most was time. Before language, perception was anchored to the present. After language, humans could braid past, present, and future into a single thread. Words allowed cause to meet consequence, memory to predict tomorrow. A sentence could travel through time. We will go where the sun rises. They came before us. It will rain. In linguistic terms, this is called displacement, the ability to refer to things not immediately here. In evolutionary terms, it was liberation from the tyranny of now. Archaeological hints of this transition appear in the late Upper Paleolithic. Complex cooperation in hunting, coordinated migration, and shared technological styles all imply the presence of advanced communication. The spread of symbolic ornamentation and burial practices suggests that meaning had become portable, sustained by story rather than sight. Yet the traces of this linguistic revolution are intangible. No fossils preserve words. What we have instead are the outcomes: social scale, cooperation, imagination. Language was the invisible infrastructure holding the expanding human world together. When people began to speak in full syntax, they gained not just communication but simulation. The brain's predictive machinery, the same system responsible for anticipating motion and shaping perception, was now tuned to linguistic input. Hearing a story activates the same sensory regions as experiencing it directly. When someone says, "the woolly mammoth charges," the listener's motor cortex lights up as if preparing to run. When they hear "the fire warms the skin," their somatosensory regions activate, as if feeling heat. Words became triggers of embodied imagination. This neurological mirroring is the foundation of empathy. Through story, individuals could feel experiences they never lived, suffer dangers they never faced, and remember events they never saw. Around the fire, imagination became collective, shared across time and tribe. The storyteller was not inventing fiction. They were distributing simulation, letting others test emotional and practical possibilities through language. To speak, however, required structure. Grammar itself was a kind of neural constraint, a framework that forced clarity out of chaos. Modern linguists describe syntax as a combinatorial system: finite words, infinite meanings. With perhaps only a few thousand terms, our ancestors could build an uncountable number of possible worlds. This flexibility is unique among animals. Other species communicate danger, hunger, territory. Only humans can say, "what if?" That small phrase, "what if," was the beginning of everything that followed: myth, science, memory, and planning. A group could imagine the migration of herds before seeing them, the pattern of stars before tracking them, the return of the rains before feeling them. The ability to construct unseen futures was the most powerful adaptation in evolutionary history. The brain that could predict a second ahead in the trees could now predict seasons, generations, even afterlives. Linguistic anthropologists describe this as shared intentionality, the capacity for multiple minds to align around abstract goals. It explains how humans coordinated building shelters, organising hunts, and navigating new landscapes. But shared intentionality also had a side effect: shared imagination. Once the group could picture something together, that imagined thing acquired emotional weight. The story itself became real through belief, guiding behaviour as strongly as physical evidence. Language, in that sense, was a cognitive technology for generating reality. The neural roots of this process lie in the same predictive systems that make perception possible. The human brain doesn't passively receive data, it predicts it, filling gaps between sensory input and expectation. Language extends this predictive loop into the social domain. When you listen to someone speak, your brain anticipates the next word, the next rhythm, the next emotional turn. This constant forecasting keeps conversation fluid, but also blurs the boundary between hearing and imagining. The line between understanding and believing grows thin. In this way, story became humanity's first virtual reality. Around the campfire, images arose not from pigment or flame, but from sound. A voice could conjure landscapes, creatures, and histories within the listener's mind. Modern neuroimaging shows that when people hear vivid descriptions, their visual cortex activates as though they were seeing the scene. In the Paleolithic night, this must have been extraordinary. Sound creating sight. The ear replaced the eye as the pathway to imagination. Language also allowed the birth of abstraction. Words for unseen things like wind, love, or memory let humans think about qualities, not just objects. Once named, the invisible could be manipulated, compared, and shared. Metaphor, the bridge between literal and symbolic thought, flourished. A mountain could be a mother. The dawn could be rebirth. These metaphors didn't decorate thought. They were thought. They gave shape to emotion and concept through sensory analogy. Every abstract word we speak today still carries a fossil of that origin. The rhythm and melody of early speech likely mattered as much as meaning. Repetition and cadence help memory, and sound itself can influence emotion. The musicality of language, what linguists call prosody, predates grammar. It connected communication to feeling. Storytelling, then, was not only cognitive, but physiological. Listeners swayed, breathed, and reacted in synchrony with the speaker. This coupling of brain rhythms created social cohesion. It made the tribe's imagination pulse as one. Over time, language began to sculpt thought itself. Cultures that emphasized action encoded it differently from those that valued description. Word structure influenced worldview. Even today, linguists find that tense systems shape perception of time, and spatial metaphors guide reasoning. The earlier speakers may not have known it, but their grammar was already shaping cognition. The story was becoming the frame through which the world was seen. This shift from seeing to speaking marked a profound cognitive trade. Vision grounds perception in the immediate and tangible. Language detaches it, allowing imagination to float free from evidence. Once humans could describe what was not there, they gained the ability to deceive, to dream, to hope. Story became the architecture of collective belief, and belief in turn reshaped behaviour. To imagine something together was to make it real in consequence, if not in substance. When archaeologists study this era, they find increasing signs of social complexity, wider trade networks, coordinated hunting sites, and long-term settlement patterns. These achievements required more than intelligence. They required narrative, a shared understanding of purpose and consequence, transmitted through words, unified minds across distance and time. The spoken story was the first infrastructure that stretched beyond the individual, and perhaps that's why the first storytellers mattered so much. They weren't historians or prophets. They were the first engineers of attention. Through sound and sequence, they guided the group's focus toward what could not be seen. Every verb was a thread connecting neurons across skulls, weaving a network of collective imagination. When a story began, the tribe's separate perceptions synchronized. The world outside might have been chaotic, but inside the circle of language there was coherence. By 12,000 years ago, as the Ice Age waned and the world warmed, these oral worlds had become vast and detailed. They explained migrations, taught ethics, preserved memory, and predicted patterns of the land. They lived in the voice, passed from generation to generation, shaped by rhythm rather than permanence. Every retelling recreated reality anew. The story was no longer just about survival, it was survival. To ask whether language replaced sight is perhaps to misunderstand what it did. It didn't replace vision, it rewired it. The brain no longer relied solely on the eye to perceive. It could now see through description, touch through metaphor, feel through syntax. The mind became multisensory in imagination, no longer limited to the immediate world. And so, somewhere in those last Ice Age nights, the human mind stepped fully into abstraction. The eye had once been the organ of knowledge. Now it shared that role with the tongue. The visible world was no longer enough. We needed the invisible one too, the one made of air and sound and memory. The story became the new environment, a shared mental ecosystem in which reality and imagination merged. And though no trace of those first words survives, their consequence does. We are still living inside the stories our ancestors began to tell beside the fire, when language first taught the mind that seeing was only one way of knowing. A piece of polished black stone, still faintly warm from the craftsman's hand, catches the morning light. For the first time, a face appears where there was none. The reflection trembles with motion, uncertain, alive. A human stares into it, perhaps curious, perhaps uneasy, and meets not a stranger, but the surface of thought itself. Around 10,000 years ago, as villages rose from mud and obsidian replaced flint, something subtle but irreversible happened. The mind began to see its own outline. Before mirrors, self-awareness existed in sensation, in movement, in the social gaze of others. You knew you were because others responded to you. But with reflection came autonomy of perception. You could see your face even when no one was watching. This moment, often overlooked in archaeology, marks one of the quiet revolutions of cognition. Somewhere in Anatolia, near the obsidian trade routes that fed sites like 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐿 and Jericho, humans learned to make surfaces so finely polished they could return an image clear enough to recognize. The material was volcanic glass, obsidian, cooled from molten rock so rapidly that it hardened smoother than any natural surface. When shaped and polished with ash, sand, and animal fat, it revealed an impossible thing: identity detached from body. Archaeologists have unearthed such mirrors in graves and domestic spaces dating from roughly 8 to 5,000 years ago. They're small, portable, often oval or circular, sized to fit a hand or lie upon a lap. Some are framed in bone, others in clay. Many show evidence of being carried or handled often, their edges smoothed by use. Their fine spots suggest a mix of the sacred and the ordinary. One discovered beside a woman's remains in Anatolia, another in a household floor deposit as if lost in daily use. These are not decorative curiosities. They are instruments of perception, technologies of the self. To understand their impact, we must imagine what it meant to see one's own face clearly for the first time. Water reflections existed, of course, but they were unstable, dependent on light and movement. A pond distorts, a river shifts, a puddle blurs with each ripple. The obsidian mirror offered permanence. For the first time, a person could hold stillness, could study their features independent of weather or circumstance. That static reflection may have deepened self-recognition, turning a fleeting curiosity into metacognition, a stable mental model of one's own appearance. The brain, long accustomed to constructing models of others for social prediction, now had a template for itself. This encounter between mind and mirror had consequences beyond vanity. Neuroscience tells us that self-recognition involves a network of brain regions, particularly in the right hemisphere, the temporoparietal junction and prefrontal cortex, areas responsible for perspective taking and empathy. To recognize oneself is to engage the same circuitry used to recognize others. Thus, a mirror is not just a reflective tool, it is an empathy engine turned inward. The same neurons that light up when watching another's gesture now respond to one's own. Seeing oneself from the outside may have expanded the cognitive sense of other, blending the boundaries of self and society in a new way. The archaeological context supports this subtle psychological shift. During the same millennia when polished mirrors appear, human burial practices begin to include personal adornments, beads, pendants, headbands, and cosmetics. Pigments once used for symbolic or ritual art were now used on faces. Red ochre, once smeared on walls, stains the bones of the living and the dead alike. The appearance of mirrors may have accelerated self-decoration, turning the body into a new kind of canvas. When one can see oneself clearly, adornment becomes deliberate rather than imagined. The evolution of reflection and identity seems to have co-evolved, each reinforcing the other. At 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐿𝐿, archaeologists discovered evidence of small clay platforms with polished surfaces in domestic spaces, possibly for grinding pigments, possibly for reflection. The settlement's walls are decorated with intricate murals, yet within those same homes people buried their dead beneath the floors, painted and adorned. The house itself became a kind of mirror, surface and depth coexisting. To live among one's reflections, both literal and symbolic, is to inhabit a new kind of consciousness, one aware of its own visibility. We can even trace this shift in the materials themselves. Early obsidian mirrors were dark and highly polished, reflecting light like still water at dusk. Later ones grew lighter, incorporating volcanic glass mixed with silica or even metal traces. This improvement suggests increasing demand for clarity, an evolving fascination with precision of image. The desire to see oneself accurately may have paralleled the desire to control one's presentation to others. In this sense, the mirror anticipated the invention of portraiture. The human mind, having externalized imagination in cave art and story, now externalized identity and reflection. Cognitively, this was profound. The mirror required the brain to reconcile two perspectives simultaneously, the first-person experience of being and the third-person view of appearance. This dual awareness, psychologists call it metacognition, was the seed of introspection. The mirror trained the mind to oscillate between actor and observer, between being and being seen. That oscillation might sound trivial, but it's what allows self-correction, planning, and abstraction. A species that could observe itself could also imagine its future self, its mistakes, its mortality. The mirror may have been one of the earliest silent teachers of that uncomfortable awareness. From a material point of view, obsidian itself has always fascinated humans. Its sharpness made it vital for tools and blades. Its sheen made it sacred. It fractures predictably, but only under skilled hands. To craft a mirror required patience, grinding with ash, polishing for hours, sometimes days. Each stage transformed chaos into smoothness, randomness into order. The process mirrored cognition itself, refining raw perception into stable representation. When the final polish revealed a face, the maker saw not just a reflection, but the evidence of control over nature's unpredictability. Perhaps this is why so many mirrors are found near burial or domestic shrines. They were thresholds between physical and imagined worlds. In ancient Anatolia and Mesopotamia, obsidian mirrors continued to circulate long after metal became common. Their reflective properties seemed to carry more than utility. The darkness of the surface absorbed light before releasing it. To look into it was to see a version of oneself suspended in blackness, alive yet ghost-like. Some scholars suggest these mirrors served in divination or medicine. Others propose they were part of grooming rituals. Both may be true. To gaze at oneself, to care for one's image, is already a ritual, one of maintenance and curiosity intertwined. What makes the mirror unique among human inventions is that it does not extend the body outward like a tool. It turns perception back inward. Fire expanded the day, stone extended the hand, but the mirror folded awareness upon itself. In that reflection, the brain encountered a paradox, the self as both subject and object. Every flicker of movement became feedback. The act of seeing became self-referential. Over time, this may have reinforced neural pathways for self-monitoring, shaping how humans evaluate emotion, morality, and appearance. The earliest mirrors were small, but their cognitive impact was vast. The polished surface also democratized introspection. Anyone could see themselves, not just leaders or artisans. In a world without photography, this was a rare privilege. Archaeological wear marks suggest mirrors were passed hand to hand, perhaps shared among family members. Each face would momentarily inhabit the same frame. The mirror became a social interface, linking identity with community. One could imagine the small wonder each time it changed hands, each face vanishing as another appeared, each person glimpsing themselves inside the same dark light. From a neuroscientific perspective, the recognition of one's own reflection is a complex feat. Infants today take roughly 18 months to consistently recognize themselves in a mirror. Many animals never do. Great apes, dolphins, elephants and magpies pass the mirror test, showing curiosity toward marks on their bodies. Humans, however, don't just recognize themselves, they evaluate. The same neural circuits that respond to others' judgments activate when we view our reflection. The mirror turned private cognition into a social rehearsal. We became both actor and audience. This intertwining of perception and evaluation may have deep roots in early societies. The rise of self-decoration, ritual grooming and personal identity all suggest that social visibility became central to survival. In small communities, how one appeared mattered as much as how one acted. The mirror allowed individuals to simulate that social gaze privately, to adjust and prepare for interaction. It gave the solitary mind a stand-in for society. What began as curiosity, an image in black glass, may thus have evolved into a habit of reflection, both literal and mental. The obsidian mirror was a device of feedback, an early neural prosthesis teaching humans to see not only themselves, but their capacity to be seen. It bridged biology and culture, making self-awareness tangible. In a sense, it closed a loop begun millions of years earlier when the first eye formed in the Cambrian seas. That eye had learned to sense light. The mirror taught it to sense self. And yet, in every reflection lies ambiguity. The face that looks back is reversed, subtly alien. The brain compensates, yet part of it never reconciles the inversion. Perhaps that small unease is why mirrors fascinated and unsettled our ancestors. They reminded them that the image was both real and false, a copy that moves independently, a double that never quite aligns. Identity, like reflection, is always one step removed from truth. Even now, to stare into a mirror too long invites a kind of vertigo. The mind flickers between recognition and doubt. Our ancestors likely felt it too, that slight disquiet of seeing oneself from outside, of confronting the fragile boundary between perception and illusion. They could not name it, but they felt it. The mirror was not merely a surface. It was the first portal between mind and matter, proof that to know oneself is also to be deceived by oneself. And somewhere in an ancient house, in the dim light of an early morning, someone lifts a fragment of polished obsidian and catches their own gaze, perhaps smiling, perhaps frowning, without realizing that they are witnessing one of the oldest hallucinations evolution ever produced. Imagine this. The sun rises over a stone courtyard filled with smoke and sound. Drums echo off walls carved with eyes, wings, and animal bodies. Beneath towering columns, hundreds of people move as one, chanting, swaying, watching the same symbol lifted toward the sky. They are not seeing a statue. They are seeing the same vision inside their minds, something vast, invisible, and shared. Around 5,000 years ago, humans began to project the architecture of their thoughts into the world around them. Villages became temples, memory became myth, and imagination became collective. For most of human history, perception was personal. A hunter saw movement in the grass. A mother felt the rhythm of her child's breath. Awareness was immediate, sensory, and small. But with agriculture came scale. More people, more coordination, and more invisible patterns to track. The rains, the harvest, the movement of the stars. The mind evolved to predict patterns for survival. Now those predictions were too large for one brain to hold. The solution was simple and revolutionary. externalize the model, build the mind into matter. The earliest temples, like those at Eridu, Uruk, and the highlands of Anatolia, were not just places of worship. They were materialized algorithms, stone frameworks for expectation and memory. The human brain is a predictive organ, constantly comparing sensory input to stored models of the world. When hundreds of people gather around a shared structure that encodes cycles of sun, flood, or fertility, those models synchronize. The temple becomes a collective brain, stabilizing the group's perception of time and order. In Mesopotamia, the ziggurats rose as layered mountains of baked clay, each level close to the heavens. In Egypt, stone pyramids mirrored cosmic order, aligning perfectly with celestial bodies. In the Indus Valley, water channels and terraces structured movement like arteries through a living organism. Each architecture was both physical and cognitive. It told people where to stand, when to bow, how to face the light. It organized prediction. These weren't merely buildings, they were instruments of thought, machines for synchronizing minds. The same was true of imagery. Anthropologists studying early urban societies find that as populations grow, gods multiply, but their faces remain oddly familiar. Eyes dominate. Wings, horns, sun discs, serpents, bulls, and birds repeat across continents. These motifs aren't random. They echo the brain's own perceptual preferences, high contrast, symmetry, and motion cues. The earliest deities, carved into clay or painted on stone, borrowed directly from the architecture of perception. They were constructed from what the human visual cortex found most compelling. Consider the massive reliefs at Uruk's White Temple or the painted walls of ancient Egyptian tombs. The gaze of the deity always meets the viewer's eyes. The proportions are exaggerated, the symmetry is perfect. Neuroscience tells us that such images trigger the brain's face detection networks, the same circuits responsible for recognizing emotion in others. These gods stare back. They activate social cognition as if they were alive. In a very real sense, they exist within our perceptual system, not outside it. But these projections were not arbitrary. They arose from necessity. As societies expanded, trust could no longer depend solely on personal familiarity. The tribe was too large for everyone to know one another. A shared watcher, omnipresent, impartial, impossible to see, became a tool for cooperation, belief-aligned behavior. The idea of an unseen observer embedded moral order into the social brain. The god's eye, painted above the city gate, was both symbol and neurological feedback loop. It reminded every passerby that they were being perceived, even when alone. Ritual amplified this synchronization. Across early civilizations, Sumer, Egypt, the Levant, the Indus, and early China, the structure of ceremonies followed patterns that today's cognitive scientists recognize as entrainment. Repetition of rhythm, sound, and movement aligns neural oscillations among participants, producing a shared physiological state. Heartbeats synchronize, breath slows in unison. When hundreds chant or move together, their individual predictions of time collapse into a single collective tempo. The god, in this sense, is not a being outside them, but a pattern within them, the rhythm that unifies perception. Take, for example, the grand processional routes of ancient Uruk, designed to funnel thousands of bodies through narrow streets toward the central temple. Archaeologists note how the architecture forces attention. Tall walls block the horizon, sound reverberates, torches flicker. The sensory field narrows, guiding focus toward a single image at the end, the statue of Inanna or the rising sun above the ziggurat. This is not random design. It is psychological engineering. The city itself induces trance. The human brain, overwhelmed by repetition and constrained vision, fills gaps with meaning. Collective illusion becomes shared revelation. Even the earliest myths reflect this neurological patterning. The god-king descending from the heavens, the serpent biting its own tail, the sun dying and reborn. All are recursive loops, mirroring the brain's internal dynamics. The hippocampus and cortex communicate in oscillations of prediction and feedback. Likewise, myth cycles represent destruction and renewal, chaos and order in perpetual rhythm. These stories weren't inventions, but translations of the brain's temporal architecture into narrative. Archaeological finds support this interpretation. In Sumer, clay tablets record elaborate rituals that align with astronomical cycles, lunar phases, solstices, equinoxes. At Egypt's Karnak, temple axes adjust across centuries to maintain alignment with rising stars. Such precision is less about devotion than calibration. The gods served as stabilizers for perception, narrative anchors in an unpredictable world. When nature's cycles faltered, as in drought or eclipse, collective anxiety spiked. The mind's predictive model had failed. To restore coherence, new myths emerged, new rituals formed, new gods appeared. It's telling that many early deities were hybrids, part human, part animal, part element. This fusion reflects the blending of categories in the brain's associative networks. When the mind searches for causes behind natural phenomena, thunder, flood, disease, it borrows imagery from what it already knows: faces, limbs, motion. The result is a composite form, optimized for attention and motion. The god is thus an emergent hallucination, not random but adaptive, a byproduct of pattern completion. Neuroanthropologists have noted that the earliest depictions of divine beings often include exaggerated sensory features: large eyes, radiating light, expanded size. Each trait corresponds to salience triggers in the human brain. Large eyes signal awareness, brightness draws attention, scale conveys importance. The brain interprets these cues as indicators of agency and power. To experience the presence of a god was, in effect, to experience one's own perceptual biases amplified to architectural scale. By around 3,000 years ago, these collective projections had reached their zenith. The great temples of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Mesoamerica were immersive experiences. Orchestrations of light, shadow, echo, and scent. Incense filled the air, drums throbbed in sync with footsteps, sunlight pierced narrow shafts at precise moments. These environments triggered sensory convergence, collapsing inner and outer worlds. When worshippers fell to their knees as the god's image appeared in light, what they felt was not deception, but coherence, the brain's confirmation that its predictions had come true. The ritual worked because it matched neural expectation. Even the materials chosen reveal an intuitive grasp of perception. Gold, for instance, dominates divine imagery across cultures. It doesn't tarnish, reflecting light like a miniature sun. Its luster interacts with motion, giving the illusion of life. Polished stone, water, and bronze serve similar functions. They mirrored the viewer, creating a feedback loop between self and symbol. The god's body shimmered because it was made from the same visual properties the human brain already associates with vitality. This shared sensory logic made deities portable across cultures. When empires rose and fell, gods morphed, fused, or migrated. In each transformation, what persisted were not doctrines but perceptual anchors: symmetry, radiance, gaze, rhythm. The architecture of belief remained consistent because it was rooted in the architecture of cognition. The human brain, wherever it lived, sought order in noise, purpose in chaos, faces in clouds. Civilization simply gave it larger canvases. To modern eyes, the colossal statues and echoing temples may look like monuments to superstition, but from a cognitive standpoint, they are monuments to the predictive mind, to our species' need to make the invisible coherent. The god was never just out there. It was in the interaction between brain, body, and environment. Each image, each ritual, each stone laid in pattern was a projection of collective perception onto the world. The temples were our first neural networks, connecting minds through architecture and sound long before electricity ever would. And yet, behind all the grandeur, something deeply human persists. The same neural circuits that generated awe and reverence also produced fear, comfort, and belonging. To stand before a towering statue was to confront scale itself, not divine judgment, but the sheer immensity of existence. The brain, overwhelmed, resolved the feeling into form. It named it. It knelt before its own projection, unaware it was both creator and witness. Even now, archaeologists uncover evidence of small personal shrines within ancient homes, miniature altars, figurines, and carved eyes tucked into corners. These intimate relics remind us that collective vision always returned to the individual mind. Each person, staring into the polished bronze or painted idol, was not worshipping an external entity, but engaging the same neural trick that makes the world appear solid: predictive coherence. To believe was to stabilize perception. Perhaps that is why gods never vanished, only changed shape. They are the echoes of the brain's first and greatest adaptation, its need to find pattern, agency, and meaning within uncertainty. The temples may crumble, but the projector remains. Every culture that ever existed built its world upon the same invisible screen, the human mind. The gods, in the end, were us, our shared hallucinations made beautiful, terrifying, and vast. And though we no longer raise ziggurats to them, we still build new temples of light and glass, still gather in synchronized awe before glowing images, still long to believe that something greater looks back. Perhaps what began as stone and smoke has simply evolved into signal and screen, the same projection, rewritten for another age. Imagine this. A philosopher sits alone in a cold 17th century room, doubting everything he can see, touch, or feel. The world around him could be a dream, he thinks. The senses could deceive. Only one truth seems unshakable. I think, therefore I am. With that phrase, René Descartes did not solve perception. He exposed it. From that moment onward, Western thought began tracing the boundary between what is seen and what is made. 5 centuries later, science has circled back to confirm what intuition once whispered. Reality, as the brain knows it, is a controlled hallucination. Modern neuroscience describes perception not as reception, but prediction. The mind doesn't passively absorb the world. It continuously guesses at it, comparing expectation against sensation. Every colour, every texture, every sound is a simulation refined by error correction. The eyes and ears are less cameras than calibration tools. Predictive processing models explain this strange economy. At every moment, billions of neurons forecast incoming data, the shape of a hand, the temperature of air, the pressure of a chair. When the prediction matches input, we call it real. When it doesn't, we experience surprise, confusion, or wonder. What we call consciousness may be the brain's summary of its best bet so far. Experiments reveal how fragile that bet can be. In the rubber hand illusion, a person's real hand is hidden, while a fake one is stroked in synchrony. Within minutes, the brain adopts the rubber limb as its own. The boundary of self shifts, proof that ownership of body is also a hallucination maintained by probability. Visual auditory illusions, phantom limbs, and synesthesia all reveal the same mechanism. The mind is not receiving the world, but continuously negotiating it. Even vision, the most trusted of senses, is largely invention. The optic nerve carries a narrow, inverted stream of raw light. The brain fills in detail, depth, and colour. The stable world you see when you blink is a guess stitched across absence. The same machinery that once saw faces in fire now manufactures constancy out of chaos. Science, then, is not the end of illusion, but its most articulate version. Instruments extend the senses, equations formalize prediction, and peer review collectively refines the hallucination until consensus feels like truth. Each discovery peels away mystery only to reveal another model, another map standing in for territory. The miracle is not that the brain hallucinates. It's that, through reason and measurement, it learned to measure the hallucination. Descartes feared he might be dreaming. Modern neuroscience suggests he was, and so are we. Yet it's a dream so consistent we can share it, test it, and build within it. The world remains the most reliable illusion evolution ever produced, and science, in its quiet way, is simply the act of waking up just enough to notice. Imagine this. You close your eyes, and the world doesn't vanish, it rearranges. Shapes soften into memory, light becomes imagination, and the steady pulse behind your ribs is the only proof you remain. The same thing happens when you open them again. The mind paints edges where there are gradients, fills silence with cause, and calls the result reality. But beneath that calm surface, perception is still guessing, an ancient simulation built by survival, not by truth. If evolution invented the world as we see it, then perhaps what we call us is simply its most intricate illusion. Every cell, every neuron, every flicker of thought is a lineage of adaptation. The eye was not designed to see what is, only what matters. The ear evolved not for sound itself, but for change within it. A twig snapping, a voice calling, a predator breathing. The senses filter endlessly, discarding more than they keep. From those fragments, the brain constructs a seamless picture, a hallucination good enough to navigate, to eat, to endure. To survive, the map became mistaken for the territory, and we mistook the story for the self. This illusion runs deep. Each memory you hold has already been edited, rewritten by the moment you recall it. Every face you remember has been redrawn to fit your current emotion. The feeling of continuity, the sense that you are the same person you were yesterday, is the brain's most persistent narrative, not its most accurate one. The I who wakes each morning is not the same I who went to sleep, but the system that believes in continuity must believe it, or else fall apart. The hallucination of self is the thread that keeps the organism coherent. And yet, within that deception, there is beauty. For the first time in the long history of life, a pattern has become aware of its own patterning. The same evolutionary machinery that once merely reacted to light now wonders what light is. The neural circuits that evolved to track motion now imagine meaning. The brain, having spent millions of years predicting the world, finally turned inward and began predicting itself. We became witnesses to the hallucination, and that awareness, however fleeting, is what we call consciousness. In a sense, perception, memory, and emotion are not errors but languages. They are translations between chaos and coherence. What we call colour is not a property of the world, it is the mind's poetry for wavelength. What we call sound is air made meaningful. What we call love is chemistry perceived as connection. Life did not evolve to reveal reality, it evolved to make existence bearable. The truth might be unbearable, and so we dream, together, awake. Across billions of years, from the first flicker of photoreceptors in a Cambrian sea to the silent reflections of a modern human at midnight, evolution has been sculpting perception into a story. Every creature lives inside its own model, a tiny theatre of sensation tuned to its survival. Ours just happens to include philosophy. We are the descendants of those who saw enough pattern to persist, enough meaning to keep moving, enough illusion to call it truth. Perhaps that is why the world feels both real and unreachable, because it is both. The trees outside your window, the stars in the dark, the warmth of another hand, All are reconstructions, electric dreams stabilized by consensus. But within that fragile consensus, something sacred happens. We find one another. We agree to believe in the same mirage long enough to build language, memory, and tenderness. We invent we. And maybe that was evolution's greatest trick. Not the eye, or the hand, or fire, but empathy. One hallucination recognizing itself in another. Across the long arc of time, matter learned to imagine, and imagination learned to care. The cosmos found a way to look back at itself and whisper, I am here. So if the world is a dream, it is not a lonely one. It is the shared hallucination of every living thing that ever struggled toward the light, stitched together by perception, sustained by meaning. And when it ends, when the mind quiets, when the projection fades, what remains is not truth lost, but the silence from which it first arose. The miracle was never that we could see reality. It was that, within all its distortions, we could see beauty, and believe it was real enough. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. I'll see you in the next story.